On the morning of August 10th, 1991, in a little rural town in Arizona, two women walked across a parking lot toward a Buddhist temple. They were there to prepare a meal for the monks who lived inside. As they walked, the women noticed that none of the monks were outside meditating or gardening, which was strange. And when they reached the front door, not only was it locked, which was strange, there was also this huge puddle of water forming in front of it, which they just couldn't understand. The women sensed something was off, but they shrugged and left the front door and found an open door on the side of the building and went inside. Minutes later, those women would come running back outside, hysterical, screaming for help. This story includes graphic descriptions of violence. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please make toast at the 5-star review button's house, but scrape all of your excess butter with all the crumbs in it back into their butter container. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the morning of Friday, August 9th, 1991, in a small town in south-central Arizona, a man stepped out of his home and stood quietly on the doorstep, his face turned to the east where the sun was just starting to show above the horizon. Even though he had gotten up early so he could get some gardening in before the real heat of the day set in, now that he was actually outside, he showed absolutely no sign of hurrying. His unlined face and dark eyes were serene as he watched the first rays of light spreading over the desert that bordered one side of the property where he lived and the cotton fields that bordered the other side. Once the sun was up, the man stood with his eyes closed, still as a statue, for several more minutes, taking in the sounds of the world waking up around him. He could hear the hum of insects, along with birds cooing and scratching in the dirt for seeds. He was also aware of the steady rhythm of his own breathing and the movement of a very slight breeze through the branches of the nearby cottonwood trees he had planted 2 years ago. For 36-year-old Buddhist monk Parush Kanthong, these early morning hours that he could spend alone in his garden were often the most peaceful and reflective part of his day. Now, opening his eyes, Parush turned his attention to the narrow path along the side of the single-story white stucco building with the red roof that he and 5 other monks called home. When Parush had first arrived in Arizona from his native Thailand 8 years ago, he had led a small Buddhist community in the state capital of Phoenix. But back in 1985, after the community had scraped together enough money to buy these 5 acres of rural farmland located 20 miles west of Phoenix, Parush had worked tirelessly to collect the money that allowed them to build this modest temple, which was called Wat Pram Kunaram. Since opening its doors 2 years ago, the temple had become an important site of worship for the 1,300 members of Arizona's scattered Thai Buddhist community. And as the abbot of the temple, an abbot is the leader of a monastery, Parush oversaw not only the services, classes, and festivals that the temple offered its worshippers, but he also oversaw the training and education of the 5 monks and 3 novices and temple helpers who currently lived there. Stepping away from the door he had been standing in that led back into the temple's dining room, kitchen, and simple bedrooms, Parush adjusted his bright saffron orange robe and began walking along the narrow path that ran the length of the temple. He listened to the gentle slap of his sandals as he slowly walked past the eggplant, basil, lemongrass, and mint that he had planted alongside the mango, banana, pomegranate, and loquat trees. Coming to a stop near the end of the path, Parush knelt down in front of one of the many little shrines that dotted the garden. As he knelt, he picked up a handful of dry soil and let it run through his fingers. Back in Thailand, August was the wettest month of the year, when rice farmers could expect 19 inches of rain. And until his move to Arizona at the age of 28, Parush marked his country's rainy season by staying indoors, so there was no chance that he and his fellow monks might accidentally step on and damage any of the rice seedlings growing in the nearby paddies. But out here in the Arizona desert, things were totally different. Water was scarce, and so it was a very precious commodity. If your property met certain minimum size requirements, you could sign up for a weekly water distribution that was delivered to each property through an irrigation system of pipes and gates. While the temple property was too small to qualify for this water allotment, Perush had worked out an agreement with his neighbor Betty Kraft, whose property also failed on its own to meet the minimum size requirements. But together, their two properties were big enough to sign up for a weekly water distribution, and so they did that, and Perush and Betty shared the water between them. He grinned as he thought of Betty. She loved gardening as much as he did. He'd see her that night, since Friday was the night that the town posted the weekly water distribution schedule. He knew Betty always worried that he might forget to close the headgate on the temple's property, which prevented their shared water allotment from flowing through to the next property along the irrigation line. And so, on whatever day they were scheduled to get their water, Betty almost always called Perush just to make sure that he had adjusted the headgate and opened his hoses so they wouldn't waste or lose even a single drop of their shared water. That was good though. Perush always enjoyed comparing notes with Betty, and he would find out this evening how her fig trees were doing. Maybe that was something he should add next year to the gardens at the temple. Collecting a handful of basil and lemongrass, Perush felt the air growing hotter, and he knew that soon he would hear the sounds of activity inside the monastery as the monks began their morning routine of meditation and work around the temple grounds. As he enjoyed his last few minutes of solitude, Perush was again thankful for the temple's remote location. In Thailand, practically the entire population was Buddhist, but in Arizona, the sight of Thai monks in their bright orange robes with their shaved heads was unusual, and it had drawn a lot of public attention and curiosity at the temple in Phoenix. But here, out in Waddell, the temple's location was so far away from the center of town that many of the town's 1,500 residents didn't even know it existed. And those who did, like Betty, they had come to welcome the sight of the monks in their orange robes quietly going about their business. And so, Perush and the other monks and Thai members of the temple were all basically left alone to meditate and practice their religion. At the core of their religion, Buddhism, is the belief that human life is one of suffering, and the only way to achieve enlightenment, or nirvana, is through meditation, spiritual and physical labor, and good behavior. Buddhists also believe in reincarnation, that you are reborn again and again after death until you reach that final state of enlightenment and you are released from suffering. Buddhist monks play a key role in the religion by living a very simple life that allows them to meditate not only on their own path to enlightenment and acceptance of the present moment, but on enlightenment, peace, and non-violence for all people. By 11 a.m., the temperature outside had reached 101 degrees Fahrenheit, and not even the cottonwood trees could shade Perush from the heat. Soon, it would be time for the monks to eat their single meal of the day. It would be made and served at the temple by a member of the community whose gift of time and food would count as service merits along the path to enlightenment. After lunch, Perush would check in with the temple's newest resident, a 75-year-old nun from Thailand who had moved into the temple just 3 weeks earlier. Visiting her was her 17-year-old grandson and novice monk, an American high school student named Matthew. Perush stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees and robes, and then he turned and walked back down the path to the side entrance of the temple that he had been standing in earlier. Before stepping back inside, he took off his sandals, and he enjoyed the smell of cooking rice wafting out from the kitchen. Once inside, Perush closed the door behind him, and then he stood there quietly for a moment. He let go of all the noise he was hearing both inside and outside of his mind. Then he opened his eyes and stepped into the nearby kitchen, and he left his handful of freshly picked herbs on the counter. At 8:30 a.m. the next day, Saturday, August 10th, Betty Kraft called the temple. At the local well last night, she and Perush had seen that their water distribution was scheduled for that day, the 10th. But that morning, Betty had found out that the distribution was going to start a bit earlier than usual, so she was calling Perush to let him know, and she wanted to remind him, again, to make sure the temple's water headgate was closed. But after dialing the number to the temple, the phone didn't ring. It was just silent. Betty didn't know why this was, and after trying again and still getting nothing, she decided to just hop in her car and make the short drive over to the temple to tell Parush in person. A few minutes later, Betty drove through the open gates of the concrete wall that surrounded the temple's 5-acre lot, and she pulled into the temple's parking area and parked her car. Getting out, she walked over to the side entrance that she knew led into the monks' living quarters. Once there, Betty quickly saw that the temple's hoses were open. Water was running out of them. But it struck her as odd that Parush had not arranged the hoses so that all the water would run into his gardens. Instead, some of the water had started to collect on the little patio right outside the door and was even overflowing into the parking lot down below. Betty felt even more puzzled when she knocked on the side door and didn't get an answer. The same thing happened when she walked around to the front entrance that led directly into the large square temple sanctuary where the monks conducted services. Not only did no one answer either door, but everything inside the building seemed unusually quiet. But not wanting to enter the monk's space without an invitation, and checking once more that the grounds were empty, Betty shrugged her shoulders. At least she knew that the temple's hoses were on and the head gate was closed. So she jumped back into her car and returned to her own property. 2 hours later, at 10:40 a.m., another car drove through the open gates of the temple into the front parking lot. Inside the car were 2 Thai women who were friends and who were both members of the temple. They were there to make the monks' Saturday meal. When the car came to a stop, the 2 women looked around and noticed something strange. There was not a single person outside working in the vegetable gardens or walking on the meditation paths. The women figured there must be a reason for this, so they just got out and headed for the front door of the temple. But before they could reach the door, they had to walk around this large puddle of water that had formed in front of the temple from all of the water pouring out of the open hoses. The women wondered why the hoses had not been adjusted to aim in other directions, but ultimately they ignored the growing puddle, and one of the women reached out and grabbed the front door handle, but when she pulled it, she saw it was locked. This was now the 3rd irregularity that the 2 women had spotted in the span of just a couple of minutes. 51-year-old Chawi Borders and her friend, Primshat Hash, were starting to get a bad feeling about what they were seeing at the temple. Something just felt off. But they quickly reminded themselves that they needed to just focus on what they were doing at the temple, not what the monks might be doing. They were there to make lunch and earn service merits. And besides, the 2 women agreed that the monks must just be inside studying or meditating, and as for the water and locked door, the monks must have just forgotten to turn off the irrigation system and open the front door to the sanctuary. So the 2 women left the front door and headed around to the unlocked side entrance. They took off their shoes outside and then stepped inside. The room they walked into was the dining room. To their left was a door that led to the kitchen. Straight in front of them was that large square temple worship area. And then to their right was a hallway that led down to 5 bedrooms that made up the monks' living quarters. The women turned left and went straight into the kitchen and got to work preparing the monks' lunch. But they hadn't been there for very long before Primshat thought she'd discovered the reason for at least some of the irregularities they had witnessed that morning. As she had walked from the kitchen back toward the side entrance to go back outside and get something from the car, she had glanced quickly down the hallway that led to the monks' 5 bedrooms, and at the front of that hallway, close to where she was a small sitting area with a couple of sofas inside. And in this sitting area, Primshat saw the monks were lying quietly on the floor between these 2 sofas. After getting what she needed from the car, Primshat returned to the kitchen and told her friend Chawi that she had just seen the monks in the sitting area and that they were either sleeping or praying. Not wanting to disturb them, the 2 women went about their meal preparation very quietly, and at some point, when Chawi thought she heard the faint ring of a phone, she immediately stepped out of the kitchen into the dining room to answer the phone before the sound could interrupt the monk's concentration or rest. But when she put the phone to her ear, she heard nothing. Thinking she must have picked up the wrong phone, as there was 2 phones in the dining room, she walked across the room to the other phone and put that phone to her ear, but this as well was silent. But as she stood there with this silent phone pressed to her ear, she looked at the first phone she had picked up, and she could tell right away that the cord connecting the receiver to the phone had been cut. Then she pulled the phone in her hand away from her ear, and she saw the same thing. The phone's cord was cut. As she realized that clearly she had not heard a phone ring because now she's seeing neither phone would work, Chawi just happened to glance at the sitting room at the front of the hallway where the monks were lying on the floor in various attitudes of prayer. And almost absently, she noticed that mixed among the colorful saffron robes that the monks wore was the long white shirt and pants worn by the elderly nun who had joined the monastery with her grandson just a few weeks ago. Chawi was suddenly very uneasy. She knew that could not possibly be right. It was absolutely forbidden that a male monk who took strict vows of celibacy would ever lie down next to a woman, let alone lie close enough that their bodies or robes would be touching. As Chawi stood there frozen, her friend Primshot stepped out into the dining room as well and began to let out this terrible wail. Because something else was horribly wrong with what the two women were looking at. There was blood everywhere in the sitting area. There was blood on the floor, on the walls, and on the two sofas. It was 11:09 a.m. that Saturday morning when the emergency call came in to the dispatcher at the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department. Chawi and Primshot, who were totally hysterical, had run barefoot to the house of a neighbor who had called 911. By 11:21 a.m., the first law enforcement officer had skidded to a stop in the temple parking lot, and 3 minutes later, 4 more officers had arrived. By 11:45 a.m., the perimeter of the temple grounds had been marked off with yellow crime scene tape, and the parking lot was full of police and medical personnel. And the news had already spread like wildfire through the Buddhist community and among local, state, and national media. It was also making headlines back in Thailand because the temple was now the site of the worst mass murder in Arizona history. Inside that small sitting room, police had found 9 people, every single inhabitant of the temple, including the abbot, Purush, all of them dead. Physical evidence at the scene did not paint a complete picture, but it did allow police to establish a few theories about what happened. There had been at least 2 killers. On the carpet near the victims were 17 .22 caliber casings and 3 spent shotgun shells. A nearby storage room had been sprayed with a fire extinguisher, and in the foam on the floor, police counted 2 different size sets of footprints made by people wearing combat-style boots. These small monastic cubicles where the monks slept had been ransacked and vandalized. The sleeping mats had been pulled off of the wooden bed frames, and what little furniture there was had been broken and knocked to the ground. Police were also able to determine that the killers had found the temple safe, but they had not been able to open it. What puzzled investigators was the fact that the temple's worship area, which was that large square room not far from the sitting area where the bodies had been found, appeared to be untouched, despite the fact that in the worship area, right near the altar, was a visible money tree with at least 20 bills still clipped to the branches. So if this had been a robbery, why didn't the robbers take those bills? Whoever had committed the crime had also left another clue behind. Overlaying the stench of clotting blood, spent ammunition, and human flesh that had already begun to decompose, there was also the smell of something else that was completely out of place in a Buddhist monastery, the stale but strong scent of cigarette smoke. Even as the first responders to the crime scene went about their grisly work of photographing the dead and collecting evidence, the sheriff of Maricopa County, 55-year-old Tom Agnos, knew his department was in way over its head trying to deal with a mass murder. So he immediately began the process of pulling together a multi-agency task force to help investigate the crime, process the crime scene, and collect and analyze any forensic evidence. But before the police could even write up their preliminary crime scene report, and just hours after the bodies had been discovered, along with the media, hundreds of members of the Asian community in and around Phoenix were gathering outside the temple wall. In the 101-degree Fahrenheit heat, reporters had already begun to broadcast and air interviews, putting forward wildly different and competing theories about possible motives for the killings. Some reports speculated that the murders were a robbery or a hate crime directed at the Asian and Buddhist communities. Others speculated that the killings were gang-related or drug-related, that maybe the temple itself or some of the monks or temple residents had direct connections to the growing trade in heroin coming out of Thailand into the United States. Meanwhile, based on their discussions with Betty Kraft, who had met with Perush at the local well in Waddell at 9:30 p.m. on the night of August 9th, along with findings from the medical examiner's office, the investigators were able to narrow down the time of the murders to between 2 and 4 a.m. on the morning of August 10th. But despite all the evidence of violence and destruction left at the crime scene, by August 12th, 2 days after the mass murder, the best lead that investigators had was just a report of a red SUV, a Ford Bronco with a white stripe, that had been seen by several different witnesses driving away from the area where the temple was located around the time that the murders were likely to have been committed. Over the next few weeks, more than 60 law enforcement personnel would follow up on more than 500 leads, including that report of the red Ford Bronco, but none of those leads would pan out. Officers dug into the private lives of the 9 victims, but they just could not come up with any person or group who might have wanted one of them or all of them dead. Members of the Asian community had raised a $10,000 reward for information leading to the killers, but no one had come forward with anything useful. But almost exactly 1 month after the murders, the task force would receive what they believed was their first real break in the case. On Monday, September 10th, police in Tucson, Arizona, called the Special Task Force headquarters in Phoenix, saying they had just gotten a tip related to the mass murder. The tip had come in that morning from a 24-year-old patient at the Tucson Psychiatric Institute who had checked himself into the facility after attempting suicide. The patient, who gave police several false names before giving them his real name, Michael Lawrence McGraw, was known in his hometown neighborhood of South Tucson by yet another name, Crazy Mike. He told Tucson police that he had something to say about, quote, some kind of murders that happened in Phoenix at the Buddhist temple. As soon as they got this tip, investigators drove to Tucson and went through the administrative process of getting Mike released from the psychiatric hospital so they could drive him back to Phoenix for questioning. Once that was done and Crazy Mike was in Phoenix, investigators at the task force headquarters spent the next 3 days questioning him during interrogations that sometimes lasted longer than 12 hours at a stretch. Between sessions, Mike was taken to a 4-star Sheraton hotel and treated to room service, but he was never allowed to sleep for more than a few hours at a stretch, and he did not have a lawyer with him for the interrogations. Eventually, Crazy Mike confessed to the temple murders, although audio recordings of the interrogation showed that Mike needed and got a lot of help from his interrogators before he actually got the details of the crime straight. On September 13th, 3 days after Mike had been brought in for questioning, police had arrested 4 other men from Tucson that Mike had said were also involved in the killings. All 4 of the accused were acquaintances of Mike, and all 4 were subjected to the same interrogation techniques that detectives had employed when they had questioned Mike. And 3 of the 4 men confessed to the murders and were immediately charged with multiple homicides. The 4th man had a solid alibi and just refused to yield to what the courts would later describe as questionable interrogation techniques by the task force. But by late September, the case against the so-called Tucson 4, which was Crazy Mike and the 3 other men who confessed, quickly fell apart. Each of the suspects recanted their confessions, saying they were, quote, coerced by investigators who frightened them, gave them details about the case, and told them that their friends had already implicated them in the crime, end quote. Not only were investigators back to square one, but the botched interrogations of the Tucson 4 had resulted in public outcry and criticism of the police and caused divisions inside of the task force, which now numbered more than 200 people. The real first break in the Waddell Temple massacre would not come until October 24th, 6 weeks after the killings. And that break was actually based on a lead that the police had gotten 1 month earlier on September 21st and had just failed to follow up on. It would turn out that on the same day that Crazy Mike phoned the Tucson Police Department on September 21st, saying he had information about the murders, investigators for the Special Task Force had also received a tip from the Office of Special Investigations at the Luke Air Force Base. Luke Air Force Base is located about 6 miles east of the Waddell Temple. The Office of Special Investigations, which is the name of the military police unit that provides law enforcement on the base, had notified the task force that they had picked up a weapon from someone driving on base, and the weapon matched the description of the one used in the Temple massacre. But in all the excitement of getting the phone tip from Crazy Mike at the psychiatric hospital and having a real live suspect to interrogate, task force detectives did not send this weapon in for testing. Instead, after picking the weapon up from Luke Air Force Base, one of the sergeants on the task force literally put the weapon behind a door in a corner of his office, and then he forgot about it until 4 weeks later when the case against the Tucson Four started to implode. At that point, with the task force scrambling for new leads, the sergeant remembered the weapon and they would send it off for testing at the Arizona State Crime Lab. The results of that test came back 4 days later on October 24th, and 2 days after that, on October 26th, investigators arrested 2 people in connection with the mass murder. And the story that these 2 people would tell police left even the most hardened detectives feeling shocked and repulsed. Based on the testimony of these 2 individuals, here is a reconstruction of what really happened in the early morning hours of Saturday, August 10th, inside the Waddell Temple. The last communication between the residents of the Waddell Temple and the outside world happened at about 11 p.m. on the night of Friday, August 9th. Perush, the abbot of the temple, had already come back from his meeting at the local well with neighbor Betty Kraft. Other monks had also returned to the temple after performing a blessing ceremony at the house of one of the temple members earlier that evening. At 11, one of the monks telephoned the woman who had prepared that day's noontime meal, asking if she would like to return to the temple the next day, Saturday, an offer she later told police she had declined. After 11 p.m., finished with their daily routine of meditation, prayer, work, and teaching, 4 of the temple's residents made their way to the small sitting room to talk and watch TV. The temple's gentle 75-year-old nun, who had spent most of her life in Thailand doing the back-breaking work of planting and harvesting rice, had made her way to her tiny sleeping quarters, less a bedroom than a closet, that had just enough space inside for a simple sleeping mat, but which gave her the required physical separation from the monks. But just as the evening was coming to a close for the residents of the temple, the night was just getting started for 2 local teenage boys, one 16 years old and one 17 years old. This was a night, in fact, that had been a long time in the making. 3 months earlier, one of the teens' brothers had told them that the Waddell Temple was full of riches like golden Buddha statues and a safe full of money. And this brother would know because he had actually spent 6 weeks that summer living in the temple as a novice monk. And so the 16-year-old and the 17-year-old became obsessed with this temple and these riches. But as they thought more and more about robbing the temple, they realized they weren't just interested in the money. They were also interested in treating this robbery like it was a full-scale military operation. And they both agreed that for this military operation to be successful, they would have to pull it off without leaving any witnesses. So back in June of 1991, while Perush and his fellow monks were out in the temple gardens just starting to plant melons, basil, corn, and sweet potatoes, the 2 teens started preparing for their robbery/war game. Both of the boys had fathers who worked at the nearby Luke Air Force Base, so the boys went to the base store and over a period of time bought the gear they needed. Boots, camouflage hats, scarves, military belts and goggles, battle harnesses, and military knives and flashlights. Getting the weapons wasn't hard either. The 16-year-old boy had access to his father's 20-gauge pump-action shotgun that he loaded up with birdshot. When you fire birdshot, it's like firing a cluster of small metal BBs all at once. And the 17-year-old would borrow a .22 caliber rifle from an unsuspecting acquaintance. By late summer, after weeks of talk and planning, the 2 teen boys had settled on a date. They'd arrive at the temple late on the night of Friday, August 9th, when they knew all the monks would be inside the temple. So just before midnight on that Friday night, the 2 boys, dressed in their full military outfits and driving an older model Mustang, turned off the car headlights as they rolled through the open gates of the temple and parked the car in the far corner of the parking lot. The boys pulled on their gloves and then checked to make sure their guns were loaded and that all the gear they would need was either hooked onto their bodies or in their respective duffel bags. Then, after nodding to one another, they put their big goggles over their eyes, pulled their hats down tight over their foreheads, and pulled their scarves up around their nose and mouths. Then they got out of the car and began walking toward the side door of the temple that led into the dining room. Just after midnight on August 10th, the quiet inside the temple was suddenly shattered. The 4 monks in the sitting area heard a bang as the side door was suddenly flung open, and a moment later, 2 people dressed in military gear were dragging them out of their seats. The air was filled with shouts, "Hit the dirt, down on the floor, now, now, now!" As the monks stumbled first to their feet and then to their knees, they stared in shock at these intruders who seemed to have just come out of nowhere. It was impossible to see the boys' faces, but the monks saw that one of the attackers was over 6 feet tall and must have weighed over 200 pounds. Up close, both of the boys smelled like beer, cigarettes, and sweat. But the monks hardly had time to process any of this before the intruders split up, one of them screaming and waving a long-barreled gun as he circled the 4 monks who were now kneeling on the floor in the 6-foot-wide space between the 2-person and 6-person sofas on opposite sides of the sitting area. Meanwhile, the other intruder ran down that narrow hallway leading to the temple's 5 bedrooms, where he dragged the remaining 2 monks, 1 novice monk, and the temple helper back to the sitting room, where they also were forced at gunpoint to join the circle of monks in the cramped space between the sofas. It was obvious after one look in the monks' bare, empty bedrooms that this temple was not full of riches like the boys had hoped. But that didn't stop the 2 boys from taking turns vandalizing, smashing, and destroying everything in front of them. And when one of the boys pulled open the door of the final room at the end of the hallway, which was really just a large closet, cowering on her knees right in front of him was the temple's oldest resident, the tiny 75-year-old nun and grandmother who had only arrived at the temple 3 weeks earlier with her 17-year-old grandson. Grabbing hold of her white shirt dress, the intruder dragged her back to the sitting area and then forced her to take her place amongst the others. After an hour spent ransacking the living quarters and temple office, the only treasure the 2 boys had found was a safe that they could not figure out how to open, and some envelopes of cash offerings from members of the temple. So, frustrated, the 2 boys would spend their second hour in the temple, switching back and forth between terrorism and more destruction. Taking turns, they circled their kneeling captives, stepping on their legs and backs, prodding them with the barrels of the rifle and the shotgun, and jumping on and off the seats of the sofa as they made their way around and around, demanding the combination to the safe and the location of any hidden valuables they were sure the monks must have somewhere. And as they tortured and degraded the 9 people in front of them, the boys smoked one cigarette after another, blowing the smoke into their captives' faces and crushing out the butt of each cigarette in a big glass ashtray that they had placed in the center of their human circle. But from the very first moment that the boys had broken into the temple, the response from the monks totally threw them off. These were not people who wanted to fight or argue or beg or even resist. Instead, the more violent and threatening the boys became, the less of a reaction they got from their victims. Instead, the monks looked around the circle and calmly made faces of encouragement at the terrified novice monk and the temple helper, who just went by the simple name of Boy, and the 75-year-old nun. At some point, Perush laced his fingers together in prayer and began to chant. The other 5 monks, who, like him, had spent years learning to accept, without question or resistance, every moment and circumstance in their lives, joined him. In Buddhism, one of the greatest meditations of all is the meditation on the inevitability of death. And as Perush looked from face to face around the circle, he wanted each one of them to know that however and whenever death came, it would bring the gift of rebirth and enlightenment. So even as the intruders physically and verbally assaulted them, trying to get them to not only give up the code to the safe, but to react to their captors with fear, Perush and the other monks just continued to mentally withdraw into the calm space of their meditation and prayer. And their strength appeared to give the other non-monks the resolve they needed to relax and be calm as well. And before long, the 17-year-old novice monk, the temple worker they called boy, and the 75-year-old nun had all bowed their heads as well and closed their eyes. And so by the time the bigger of the two boys finally lifted the barrel of his shotgun and fired 4 rounds into the circle of kneeling figures, blowing off kneecaps and fingers and sending birdshot into the soft skin of necks and faces, his victims had already left the world of flesh and blood behind. As the victims silently absorbed the blasts from the shotgun, the second intruder walked up behind one of the victims, he raised his rifle, and he fired 2 shots into the back of their head. As the victims slumped forward with their hands still laced together in front of their chest in prayer, the other 8 victims didn't make a sound. They just continued to pray and meditate, knowing they were next. For the next several minutes, the second attacker slowly made his way around the circle, systematically putting at least 2 rounds into the back of each of the victims' skulls. After making sure that all 9 people inside the temple were dead, the 2 intruders packed up the money and personal items they had stolen from the temple and headed back out the side door. They ran back to their car, pulling the scarves down from their sweat-soaked faces, and began gulping in the hot, dry, and clean desert air. And then they drove out through the open gates of the Buddhist temple and back into their everyday normal lives. Except that 12 days later, on August 21st, military police on Luke Air Force Base found a .22 caliber rifle in the trunk of a car they had pulled over for suspicious activity. The rifle belonged to the driver, who had just recently loaned the weapon to the passenger with him in the car, a 17-year-old teenager named Jonathan Duty. It wasn't until 1 month later, September 20th, that the police report describing the traffic stop and the weapon would find its way to the task force investigating the mass murder, and it would be 4 weeks after that before members of the task force would finally get around to having that weapon tested and find that it was the murder weapon used in the Temple massacre. Once those results came back in, it would take 2 days for task force investigators to track the rifle back to 17-year-old Jonathan Duty and to his accomplice, a 16-year-old named Alex Garcia, who was 6 foot 3 inches tall and who weighed 220 pounds. Alex was the first to confess to the murders, saying that Jonathan was both the mastermind of the robbery and the one who walked around the ring of victims and shot them all in the head, execution style. It was also Jonathan Duty's half-brother, who had spent time as a novice monk living in the temple that summer, who had said there were riches inside of the temple. When the boys were asked why they committed this horrible crime, Jonathan told police he just wanted to get money to buy a car, and Alex told police he wanted, quote, walk-around money that would impress the girls. As for why they had killed everyone, they said they were just following their plan to not leave any witnesses behind. Although, despite claiming to have this well-thought-out military-style robbery all planned out going into the temple, it was fairly obvious that once the boys actually got inside, violence and destruction became the focus, not the robbery. This is likely why the boys did not take that money that was just sitting in plain sight near the altar in the worship room. At the end of the attack, Jonathan and Alex had left the temple with just under $2,800, 2 stereos, 6 cheap cameras, a low-end video recorder, a pair of binoculars, and a handheld bullhorn. In addition to their confessions, forensic analysis of the shoe prints and the saliva left on the cigarette butts found at the temple also conclusively linked the boys to the killing and the crime scene. After 3 different trials, both teenagers were finally convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The Tucson 4, who were falsely accused and arrested for the murders, were released from jail on November 2nd after Jonathan and Alex said that no one aside from themselves was involved in the temple murders and robbery. In 1994, Maricopa County paid the Tucson 4 $2.8 million in damages for false arrests and defamation. Within weeks of the mass murders, the Waddell Temple reopened under the leadership of Abbot Winai Booncham, a Thai monk who had been longtime friends with Perush. Booncham said that after he had taken his friend's body back to Thailand to be cremated, Perush started appearing to Booncham in his dreams. And even though the temple did not reopen as a living and study space for monks until after serious security measures were put in place, Booncham moved into the temple immediately after the murders. When asked why he did that, Booncham said that he saw his friend, Parush, everywhere in the temple, and so he was not afraid. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please make toast at the 5-star review button's house, but scrape all of your excess butter with all the crumbs in it back into their butter container. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on every platform is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. At around 9 p.m. on September 13th, 2006, a college student walked toward her friend's apartment in the small town of Valley City, North Dakota. She walked up the steps and was about to knock on her friend's door when she was hit with this really powerful chemical smell, like cleaning chemicals. She looked around, wondering where the smell was coming from, and that's when she realized it was coming from her friend's apartment. More confused than worried, the friend knocked on the door, but there was no answer. So she reached down and tried the handle, and it was unlocked, so she opened it up. And when she looked inside, she began to scream. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please go to the Amazon Music follow button's wedding and make sure to sneakily replace their first dance song with episode number 1 of our brand new show, Run Fool. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a bright, cool afternoon in early September of 2006, 22-year-old college senior Mindy Morgenstern walked out of her one-bedroom apartment in the small college town of Valley City, North Dakota. Mindy was tall and athletic, with curly black hair that came down to her shoulders. She wore a tank top, sweatpants, and running shoes. Mindy felt the sun beat down on her face as she carried her 2 empty laundry baskets down the steps outside of her second-floor apartment to the apartment complex's laundry room on the first floor. As Mindy got close to the laundry room, she heard 2 of the dryers buzzing. Mindy smiled. She'd clearly timed her trip perfectly. Mindy stepped into the cramped laundry room, pulled her clothes out of each dryer, and piled them into the baskets. Then she headed back towards her apartment. Mindy passed a young couple on the steps, and so she said hello and smiled. It was a pretty small apartment complex, and so Mindy made sure to be friendly to everyone she ran into there. In fact, most of her neighbors knew Mindy as the young woman who always had a smile on her face and a kind word to say. The couple said hello back to Mindy and smiled as well, and then Mindy continued the walk back up to her apartment. Mindy grabbed her key from her pocket and she tried to unlock the door, but she was really struggling to balance the laundry baskets in her arms as she tried to do this. At the same time, Mindy heard a voice behind her, and her neighbor, Mo Gibbs, swooped in and grabbed one of the baskets before it fell out of Mindy's arms. Mindy laughed at herself and then got the door open. She took the basket from Mo, thanked him for his help, and she went inside. Mindy put the baskets on the floor and pushed them up against the wall in the entryway. She knew she should probably just put her clothes away now, but she had some studying she wanted to finish first. So Mindy walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. She reached over and grabbed a pen and a notebook from the coffee table, leaned back on the couch, and started reading through some notes on sports medicine that she'd taken for her class. In high school, Mindy had been a basketball star, and she had dreamed of playing in college, and maybe even professionally in the WNBA someday. But not long after her high school graduation, Mindy had unfortunately been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis, or MS for short, is a chronic disease of the central nervous system that can affect a person's vision and movement and can cause fatigue and loss of balance. Since her diagnosis, Mindy had been doing well with treatment and medication, but the disease had forced her to give up playing basketball competitively. But as crushing as that was, Mindy had never let it get her down. She was a religious person who believed God had a plan for everybody, and so she had told herself that being a professional athlete just wasn't part of God's plan for her. But still, Mindy did love sports, and so she wanted to find another way to connect with athletics without actually participating in them. So she had spent her time in college studying to become a physical therapist someday, and she had also started working as an assistant coach for a high school basketball team in the area. In her living room, Mindy was going over her notes when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She put her notes down, grabbed her flip phone, and looked at the caller's number on the small digital display. Mindy took a deep breath. She really didn't want to talk to the person who was calling, but she thought it was rude not to answer. So, feeling resigned, she flipped open the phone and said hello, and she heard the voice of a man in his mid-50s on the other line. And before Mindy could get a word in after saying hello, the man said how excited he was that he'd caught her when she wasn't busy. The man on the other line was Rodney Kuznia, the father of Mindy's ex-boyfriend. Mindy and Rodney's son had broken up over a year ago, but when they were together, it had been very serious. Mindy had even thought they'd get married someday. But her boyfriend had moved to another city for college, and he had gotten tired of being in a long-distance relationship. So he had broken up with Mindy and stopped talking to her. But his father, Rodney, had stayed in Mindy's life. After the breakup, Rodney had called occasionally just to check in on Mindy. Mindy and Rodney had gotten to know each other pretty well when she was dating Rodney's son, so at first Mindy thought the calls were kind of nice. A father figure just making sure she was okay. But after a short time, it all kind of changed. Rodney had started calling several times a week, and Mindy just didn't really like it. Mindy's friends had told her she needed to cut Rodney off completely, just tell him to never call again. And if he did call, she needed to ignore it. Mindy hadn't gone that far, but she had told Rodney that he really needed to back off, and that it wasn't right that he kept calling her all the time. But Rodney clearly had not gotten the message. On this particular phone call, Rodney asked if maybe Mindy would want to get together for dinner sometime. When Mindy heard this, she just sighed. She could hear her friends' voices in her head. "You can't do this. Tell him to go away." Then, in a very calm, polite voice, Mindy told Rodney that she did not think that was a good idea. And she told him again that he really needed to stop calling her so much. Mindy then said goodbye, hung up, and slipped her phone back into her pocket. She hoped Rodney would finally take the hint this time and actually leave her alone. Mindy picked up her notes again, but she couldn't focus. The phone call had totally thrown her off. She thought about calling her ex-boyfriend to let him know what was going on, but things hadn't ended well between them, and she didn't feel like stirring up any bad feelings. So she stood up, stretched, and headed outside to take a walk. Even though multiple sclerosis had kept Mindy from pursuing her basketball career, she still stayed very active. And as much as she loved being around other people, she was almost never happier than when she was outside by herself going for a walk, feeling the sun beat down on her with the wind at her back. And that day, going for a walk outside did the trick. By the time she got back to her apartment, she'd put the stress of the phone call with Rodney behind her. Once she was back inside her apartment, Mindy carried the laundry baskets to her room, and she put her clean clothes away. Then she took a shower, got dressed, and went out to meet her two best friends for dinner. Later that night, when she got back from dinner, Mindy parked her car, stepped outside, and headed up the steps to her apartment. After her walk earlier that day, and now after hanging out with her best friends for the night, Mindy was in a great mood and smiling ear to ear. But then, something strange happened when Mindy got to her door. She felt the hair on her neck stand up. It felt like someone was watching her. She turned around, but she just saw the cars in the parking lot and the outline of the trees in the moonlight across the street. But Mindy still felt uneasy. So she got inside her apartment as fast as she could, and she closed and locked the door. She sat down on the couch and tried to calm herself down. Mindy's friends often made fun of her and said she was afraid of her own shadow, so Mindy told herself her friends must be right, that she was just making things up in her head and getting scared for no reason, and that everything was actually just fine. At around 12:45 p.m. on September 13th, 2006, so over a week after the phone call from Rodney, Mindy walked down the steps outside her apartment, carrying an empty laundry basket in her hands like she'd done a week earlier. Mindy didn't understand how it was already time for her to do laundry again, but she and her two best friends had plans to go out that night, and she hadn't found anything clean that she wanted to wear. So Mindy made her way to the laundry room, took her clean clothes out of the dryer, and piled them high inside of her basket. She was excited to go out that night. She and her friends were always busy with school, with work, or with guys they were dating, but they always made time for each other. And for Mindy, who had grown up in a small town and been really close with her family, having good friends like that made all the difference in the world. Mindy had been nervous when she first moved away from home to go to school, but now she couldn't imagine living somewhere without her two best friends right nearby. Mindy carried the basket out of the laundry room, walked up the steps to her apartment, got her key out of her pocket, and unlocked the door. This time it was a bit easier because she only had the one laundry basket in her arms. Once inside the apartment, Mindy put the laundry basket down and pushed it up against the wall in the entryway, but when she turned around to close her door, she saw someone standing there. Mindy smiled politely and was about to reach out and still just close the door on this person, but before she could, this person just stepped right inside of her apartment and slammed the door behind them. Over an hour later, so at about 2 p.m. that day, Mindy's neighbor, Mo Gibbs, the guy who had helped her get inside of her apartment the week earlier, he stepped out of his apartment carrying a large moving box in his arms. He was going to load up his car downstairs because he, his fiancée, and her younger daughter were in the process of moving to another apartment complex. But when Mo walked past Mindy's apartment, he stopped. The scent of a cleaning product or disinfectant hit him really hard, like somebody had poured out a bunch of Pine Sol nearby. But regardless, Mo just walked past her door and made his way downstairs to the parking lot. And for the rest of the day, other residents of this complex noticed that same really intense chemical smell coming out of Mindy's apartment, but nobody thought it was anything to worry about. Then, at about 9 p.m., so roughly 7 hours after Mo had passed by the door and first noticed that smell, Mindy's two best friends pulled into the parking lot of Mindy's apartment complex. They had been trying to get a hold of Mindy for a while because they had thought she was going to meet them at a bar that night. But when Mindy never showed, and when she didn't answer her phone, they started to get worried because Mindy always answered her phone. One of Mindy's friends opened the passenger side door, stepped outside, walked through the parking lot, and went up the steps towards Mindy's apartment. But she stopped cold about halfway up because she was hit with that really intense smell that smelled like Pine Sol. Mindy's friend figured the apartment management must be cleaning the floors or something, so she just kind of shook off the smell and continued walking up to Mindy's door. When she got there, she knocked, but Mindy didn't answer. So the friend banged harder on the door, but still, no one came to the door. Then she grabbed the doorknob and she felt it turn in her hand. The door was unlocked. And that seemed really weird because as a young woman living alone, Mindy was hyper-vigilant and always made sure to lock her door. And so with a lot of apprehension, Mindy's friend opened the door and stepped inside, but immediately they stopped because there was something on the ground that made them scream. The friend fumbled for their phone, pulled it out, dialed 911, and then they turned around to run back outside, go downstairs, and tell their friend in the car what they had just seen, but the friend was blocked by a man standing in Mindy's doorway, and suddenly Mindy's friend was screaming even louder. Minutes after Mindy's friend had called 911, Sergeant Dave Swenson of the Valley City Police Department was sitting on his couch watching TV when his phone rang. Swenson glanced down and saw it was the police dispatch. He turned off the TV and answered the phone. On the other line, the dispatcher said they'd just gotten a call from a young woman who was screaming and very upset about something that had happened to her friend. She was so upset that the dispatcher wasn't exactly sure what had even taken place, But the young woman had said something about a strangling. The dispatcher gave Swenson the address of the incident, and he checked and saw it was an apartment complex only about a block from Swenson's house. So he said he'd be over there in a minute and hung up the phone. Swenson was young and was an active part of the small Valley City community. So as he made the short drive down the street, he worried about the young woman who had made the 911 call. It was pretty rare in Valley City for the police to get distraught calls like that. Swenson pulled his car into the apartment parking lot, and he saw two women in their early 20s running towards him and a man pacing back and forth a few feet behind them. Swenson parked his car and stepped outside. The lot was pretty dark, but he could still tell that both women coming towards him had obviously been crying. When the women reached him, Swenson introduced himself, and then one of the women told him something terrible had happened up in her friend's apartment. Swenson told the women to wait right there, and then he rushed past them and the man who was pacing back and forth, and he went up the steps to Mindy's apartment. He walked inside, and immediately he was hit with that smell of pine sol. Then Swenson looked down at the floor, and he saw Mindy's body, and for a second, he almost wanted to cry. Swenson knew Mindy. He had spent time on the college campus where she went to school, and he was a big supporter of the college and high school sports teams in the area, and he had often met Mindy at games. Swenson thought Mindy was one of the kindest, brightest young people he knew, and he couldn't believe what he was now looking at. Mindy was lying on her side just a few feet from the apartment's entryway. Blood covered her shirt, there was a cloth belt wrapped around her throat, and there was a knife with the handle broken off sticking out of her neck. Swenson also saw an empty Pine Sol bottle laying right next to her. Swenson grabbed his phone out of his pocket and called the station. He knew the small Valley City Police Department was going to need help with a violent crime like this. About 15 minutes later, Special Agents Mark Saylor and Calvin Dupree from the Bureau of Criminal Investigation pulled into the parking lot outside of Mindy's apartment. The Bureau of Criminal Investigation is a state law enforcement agency in North Dakota that aids local police departments with certain cases. Saylor and Dupree stepped out of the car and saw the flashing lights from local police cruisers that had already arrived at the scene. And they saw an officer standing with two young women and a man in the parking lot. Saylor and Dupree waved to that officer and then walked over to the group. Both of the agents were tall with broad shoulders, and they both looked very intimidating. Saylor told Mindy's two friends and the man that was with them that he and Dupree would need to ask them some questions, but it might still be a little while, so he thanked them in advance for their patience. Saylor's voice was soft and calm, a contrast to his physical appearance. Saylor and Dupree left the group and walked across the parking lot and up the steps to Mindy's apartment. They put on their gloves and went inside with the few other local officers that were already in there. Like everyone else who had been near Mindy's apartment that day, the first thing Saylor and Dupree noticed beyond Mindy's body was the strong smell of Pine Sol. The agents approached Mindy's body and crouched down to get a closer look. It was immediately evident to them that whoever had done this had poured Pine Sol all over Mindy's body and then tossed the empty bottle to the ground. They figured that the killer must have done that to try to get rid of any physical evidence they might have left behind on Mindy's body. After spending a few minutes examining the victim, Saylor and Dupree did a sweep of the small apartment. In Mindy's bedroom, they saw photos of her and her parents, and of her goofing around with her friends. There were sports trophies and ribbons, and suddenly it just hit both of the agents how young Mindy was and how happy she looked in every picture they had taken of her. It didn't take long for Saylor and Dupree to notice that really nothing in any of the rooms seemed out of place, and there was no sign of forced entry, so this did not look like a robbery to them. Not long after the agents had walked through the apartment, state forensics officers arrived. They got right to work examining blood spatter on the floor and on Mindy's body. Then Saylor and Dupree watched as one of the forensics officers examined Mindy's hands and fingers, and at some point, that officer turned and said he'd found something. Parts of Mindy's fingernails had broken, and she had scratches on her hands. The officer said that indicated that Mindy had put up a fight against her attacker. The forensics officer examined Mindy's fingernails even closer, and he was convinced there would be DNA material from the killer under Mindy's nails. So the officer ordered that Mindy's hands be treated as vital evidence from that moment moving forward. And so another forensics officer approached Mindy's body with 2 evidence bags, and Saylor and Dupree watched as the forensics officers worked together to painstakingly slide these evidence bags over each of Mindy's hands, and then once they were over, they tied the bags off to keep Mindy's hands from being corrupted until an autopsy could be performed. While the forensics team continued working in the apartment, Saylor and Dupree headed back outside to the parking lot. Once there, they approached Mindy's 2 friends and that man, who were all still standing with a local officer. Mindy's friend, who had actually discovered the body, told the agents that she and her other friend had wanted to meet Mindy at a bar that night, but Mindy never showed up, so they came here to check on her. Then Agent Saylor asked the man who was there if he was a friend too, but the man shook his head. He said his name was Robert Linz, and he was one of Mindy's neighbors. He said he'd heard screaming outside of his apartment, so he'd run out to see what was going on. Then Robert said he saw Mindy's friend in the apartment, and he walked in to make sure she was okay, and that's when he saw Mindy lying on the ground. Saylor and Dupree thanked Mindy's 2 friends as well as the neighbor, Robert, and the agent said they would probably need to follow up with all of them soon. Then Saylor and Dupree walked through the parking lot to go back to Mindy's apartment. But as they walked, they talked about Mindy's neighbor, Robert. The guy was wiry and covered in tattoos, which was really not a typical look for people who lived in Valley City. But Saylor and Dupree didn't really care about Robert's tattoos. What they cared about was they had noticed multiple cuts on one of Robert's hands. In the early morning of September 14th, so several hours after Mindy's body had been discovered, Special Agents Saylor and Dupree stepped outside of Mindy's apartment after a long night of combing the place for evidence. The sun was starting to rise and the morning was quiet, but Saylor and Dupree knew that would change as soon as the news about Mindy's murder began to spread through this small town. The agents had worked enough cases in tight-knit communities to know that panic and fear can easily rip through a place like a virus whenever a horrible crime has been committed. As the state crime lab ran tests on blood and DNA evidence found at the scene, Saylor and Dupree wanted to get a jump on the investigation, and they wanted to start with Mindy's tattooed neighbor, Robert. Saylor and Dupree had enough experience to know that some killers would come right back to the scene of the crime when their victim had been discovered. Killers often did this to monitor police activity or to try to alter evidence before police arrived. The agents did not think Mindy's 2 girlfriends had anything to do with her murder, but Robert seemed like a legitimate suspect. Forensics officers had said they believed Mindy put up a fight, and Robert had those fresh cuts all over his hand. So, Saylor and Dupree began by running a quick background check on Robert. The check revealed that Robert had moved to North Dakota from California, and when he was still in California, he had served over 2 years in prison for stealing a car at gunpoint. Later that morning, Saylor and Dupree interviewed Robert in a small interrogation room at the local police station. Robert was very jittery, like he couldn't sit still during this interview, but he was polite and respectful when he answered the agents' questions. Robert told them again that he had just heard a woman screaming outside of his apartment, so he had gone out to see what was wrong. Then he said he actually stood in the doorway of Mindy's apartment, which initially scared the friend. Then he had actually gone in and checked for Mindy's pulse with the back of his hand, but he couldn't find one, and so that was when he knew she was dead. Saylor and Dupree looked at each other almost like they weren't sure what they had just heard. Dupree asked Robert why he would check Mindy's pulse with the back of his hand and not the tips of his fingers. And without hesitating, Robert said he did that because he did not want to leave his fingerprints on the body. The agents just stared at Robert for a second. For him to be more concerned about leaving fingerprints on the body than just simply finding a pulse in this critical time-sensitive moment, it just seemed off. It frankly seemed like the actions of a criminal or of a killer. But Saylor and Dupree knew this guy had done time in prison, so there was a chance he understood if fingerprints were found on a dead body, he would automatically become a primary suspect, and the cops might not give him the benefit of the doubt. So Saylor and Dupree were not going to proclaim Robert's guilt right away, no matter how strange and suspicious his actions were. Then, the agents asked Robert how he got the cuts on his hand, and Robert said he had gotten them the day before at the steel manufacturing plant where he worked. He said getting cuts like this was just part of the job. Saylor asked Robert if he would submit samples for a DNA test, and Robert said he would. Shortly after, an officer stepped into the interrogation room and swabbed the inside of Robert's mouth for the DNA sample. Then Dupree and Saylor let Robert go, but they told him not to leave Valley City because they might want to speak to him again. Later that day, officers followed up on Robert's alibi that he had been at work, and multiple people at the steel manufacturing plant said, yep, Robert had been working at the time Mindy had supposedly been murdered. But Saylor and Dupree weren't ready to write off Robert as a suspect quite yet. It was possible his friends could be lying for him, or that they simply had not seen him leave work at some point during the day. Still, Saylor and Dupree did not want to fixate on just one suspect while they were still waiting on test results from DNA samples found under Mindy's fingernails. And because there had been no sign of forced entry into Mindy's apartment, the agents thought there was a good chance Mindy had known her killer. So they focused their investigation on two groups, Mindy's friends and her neighbors. A couple of days into the investigation, and Agent Saylor and Dupree returned to Mindy's apartment complex to interview as many of her neighbors as possible. The agents were accompanied by a local officer, and when they all got to the parking lot, that officer immediately recognized someone. Mindy's neighbor, Mo Gibbs, the man who had helped Mindy hold her laundry while she unlocked her door a couple of weeks earlier, was loading more moving boxes into his car. Mo was a jailer at the county jail, and so he knew most of the officers at the Valley City Police Department. The officer waved hello to Mo and said that they'd love to talk to him to see if maybe he could help them with their investigation. Mo said he'd be happy to help, and he slid a moving box into the backseat of his car and then walked over to that officer and the two agents. Mo was this really tall, huge guy who was built kind of like a tank, and he had a big smile and bright eyes. Agent Saylor said to Mo that because he worked in law enforcement, he might have noticed something on the day of Mindy's murder that the other people in the apartment complex who did not work in law enforcement might have missed. Mo nodded and thought about it for a second, and then he said the one thing he had noticed was the smell of disinfectant on the second floor of the apartment complex on the day Mindy died. But he had just figured somebody was going overboard with their cleaning. Then Saylor asked if Mo could give them any other information about Mindy that could possibly point them in the right direction. Mo said he didn't know Mindy well, but everybody at that complex knew Mindy was like this unbelievably nice person who was kind to everyone. And so Mo said, he couldn't imagine anyone who actually lived in the apartments doing this to her. That maybe it was somebody who did not live in this complex. The special agents and the local officer thanked Mo for his insight, and then they began making their way towards the complex to begin doing interviews with other neighbors. And throughout the day, as Saylor and Dupree talked to more of Mindy's neighbors, they almost all told the same story as Mo. Mindy was nice to everybody, and she always seemed happy, and so they couldn't understand how anyone from this complex, or really anywhere, would have wanted to hurt her. That day, investigators were able to take DNA samples from a number of Mindy's neighbors, but the tests would take time, and investigators couldn't automatically rule anyone out yet. So Saylor and Dupree shifted their focus from the people at the apartment complex to Mindy's friends. And right away, several of Mindy's friends all said the same thing. The police needed to look into Mindy's ex-boyfriend. He and Mindy's breakup had been pretty bad, and most of her friends thought Mindy still had feelings for him, but he didn't feel the same way. So there was a chance that maybe they had gotten into a fight and things maybe turned violent. The following day, Saylor and Dupree met with Mindy's ex-boyfriend, who went to college in a different city. And they discovered pretty quickly that he had been on his own college campus at the time they believed Mindy had been killed. But Mindy's ex-boyfriend told Saylor and Dupree this story that seemed so bizarre to them that they almost immediately changed the focus of their entire investigation. Mindy's ex-boyfriend said that his own father, Rodney Kuznia, was obsessed with Mindy. And no matter how many times he had asked his dad to stop calling Mindy and to please leave her alone, his dad had refused. Rodney would tell his son that he and everybody else didn't understand the powerful connection he shared with Mindy. Soon after talking to Mindy's ex-boyfriend, Saylor and Dupree were able to search Mindy's cell phone records, and they discovered that Rodney had called Mindy several days in a row leading up to the murder. Then they also saw that he had left Mindy multiple voicemails after she had been killed. And when they listened to those voicemails, they heard Rodney crying and saying he knew what had happened to Mindy and how he couldn't believe he had been robbed of having her in his life. And so based on those voicemails and the conversation they'd had with Mindy's ex-boyfriend, Saylor and Dupree were convinced that Rodney did have a very unhealthy obsession with the 22-year-old Mindy. They also believed Rodney was ultimately interested in having a full-blown romantic relationship with Mindy, or at the very minimum, a sexual relationship with her. And they thought, maybe if Rodney had shown up to Mindy's apartment to try to act on those desires, but Mindy denied him, that Rodney might have snapped and killed her. A few days after Mindy's murder, Agent Saylor and Dupree sat across a small table from Rodney inside of a police station interrogation room. Rodney had white hair and a white mustache that went down to his chin and looked like a horseshoe. He wore jeans, a t-shirt, and a camouflage trucker hat. From the minute Rodney sat down, he had tears in his eyes. Saylor began by asking Rodney to explain his relationship with Mindy. Rodney said he was like a father to her, but then he immediately followed that up by saying he actually loved Mindy because she reminded him so much of his wife when his wife was young. Rodney said his family did not really understand his feelings for Mindy, and they didn't really know how often he talked to her. He said if they did, they would be even angrier with him than they already were. Saylor and Dupree just sat there with stunned looks on their faces. They had seen plenty of older men who were interested in younger women, but there was something about Rodney that just seemed totally different to them. And neither of them could tell if this guy was putting on some elaborate act to cover up what he did, or if he was really paralyzed with grief. Then Rodney looked up at the agents with his red eyes and said, quote, "God picked a beautiful flower," end quote. And then Rodney started crying even more. Saylor and Dupree kept looking over at each other, wondering if maybe one of them should step forward and kind of calm Rodney down and get him to talk again, but neither of them wanted to stop Rodney in fear he might suddenly admit something because of how upset he was. And so Saylor and Dupree just kind of sat there and let Rodney cry. Finally, Rodney would collect himself and he would sit up straight and wipe the tears from his eyes, and then Saylor asked him where he had been on the day of Mindy's murder. And Rodney said he had been working on his farm with one of his sons. Saylor asked Rodney if he would submit a DNA sample for testing, and Rodney said he would. So, after an officer had swabbed Rodney's mouth for samples, Saylor and Dupree decided to let him go, at least until they got the DNA test results back and they had looked into his alibi. Rodney stood up in the interrogation room, he hugged the agents, and walked out. The interview with Rodney proved to be one of the strangest that Saylor and Dupree had ever conducted. But despite being totally unsure if Rodney really was just sad or was involved, he now was the leading suspect, along with Mindy's neighbor, Robert, who had checked Mindy's pulse with the back of his hand. But the investigators wanted the results of both men's DNA tests before they'd be willing to make an arrest. So in the meantime, they continued to dig into their suspects' alibis to see if they could find any flaws and maybe catch a clear break in the case. On September 19th, 2006, so 6 days after Mindy's murder, almost 500 people gathered in a local high school gym for Mindy's memorial service. Mindy's parents had planned to have the service in their church where Mindy had spent so much time when she was younger, but there had been such a large public outpouring for Mindy that her parents knew the church would not be big enough to hold everyone who wanted to pay their respects. In the high school gym, Mindy's friends talked about what a light in the world Mindy had been, how she was that rare kind of person who dedicated herself to spreading joy and making other people's lives better. And Mindy's parents urged people to remember Mindy as the happy, kind, beautiful young woman she had been. It was still less than a week after Mindy's murder, but in the days leading up to the memorial service, pressure had really started to mount on the investigation. Local residents called into the police station wanting to know if it was safe for them to leave their houses and just walk the streets of Valley City. Saylor and Dupree understood their concerns. An unsolved murder in a small town often convinced people that they could be the next victim. But Saylor and Dupree felt like they were getting close to finding Mindy's killer. Mindy's ex-boyfriend's father, Rodney, had been obsessed with her, and obsession was definitely a viable motive. Then there was her neighbor, Robert, who had gone out of his way not to leave fingerprints at the scene. And so Saylor and Dupree were almost certain that when the DNA test results came in, those results would lead them right to Rodney or Robert. On September 20th, the day after Mindy's memorial service, Agent Saylor received a call while he and Dupree were meeting with the investigative team at the Valley City Police Station. Saylor picked up his phone, and someone from the state crime lab told him that they had the results back from several of the DNA tests that were taken during the investigation. And one of those samples matched the DNA samples taken from under Mindy's fingernails. And it turned out those DNA samples belonged to someone who already had a criminal record. Saylor hung up the phone and told Dupree what he just heard. Then the agents thanked the local officers on the investigative team for all their hard work, and Saylor said they now knew who had killed Mindy. Based on DNA test results, evidence found at the scene of the crime and on the victim's body, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe happened on September 13th, 2006, the day someone murdered 22-year-old Mindy Morgenstern. At 12:45 p.m. that day, the killer watched Mindy pull her clean clothes out of the dryer inside of her apartment complex's laundry room. The killer thought about going up and speaking to Mindy, but ultimately they decided it would be better if they surprised her. So the killer stepped away from the laundry room and quickly walked across the first floor of the apartment complex. Then they ran up the steps to the second floor, they eyed Mindy's apartment, and then walked around a corner so they could see her apartment without being seen themselves. Then the killer waited for a couple of minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, the killer saw Mindy reach the top of the steps and walk towards her apartment door. Then they watched as Mindy reached into her pocket and took out her key. At this point, the killer quickly moved from their hiding spot around the corner and walked toward Mindy's front door. And they were only a few feet away when Mindy stepped inside and pushed the laundry basket up against the wall. The killer stepped right into Mindy's doorway, and when Mindy turned around to close and lock the door, the killer just stood there smiling. Mindy smiled back, but before Mindy could say anything, the killer grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her back into the entryway. Then the killer stepped inside her apartment and slammed the door, trapping both of them inside. The killer moved in on Mindy, but Mindy lunged at the killer. Mindy was fast and strong, and she thrashed at the killer, but the killer was able to get a hold of Mindy and wrap their arms around her and throw her hard to the floor. Mindy lay there for a second stunned, and as she did, the killer glanced around the room and saw a cloth belt near the pile of clothes in the laundry basket. Without thinking, the killer grabbed the belt and then crouched over Mindy, and before Mindy could try to get to her feet, the killer began wrapping the belt around Mindy's throat, and they began tightening their grip. Mindy scratched and clawed at the killer's hands, but they held on tight and kept pulling harder and harder on that belt. Mindy gasped for air over and over again until she couldn't anymore, and then finally the killer loosened their grip, and Mindy collapsed fully on the floor and stopped fighting. But the killer could still hear Mindy wheezing. She was alive. And the killer knew they had already been in the apartment much longer than they had planned. So the killer left Mindy struggling to catch her breath on the floor, with the belt still wrapped around her neck, and they rushed into the kitchen. They began pulling open all the drawers until they found a large, sharp kitchen knife. Then the killer took that knife and marched back to where Mindy was still on the floor. The killer crouched down again, grabbed Mindy by the hair, tilted her head back, put the blade just above where the belt was wrapped around her, and slit Mindy's throat. Afterwards, the killer jabbed the knife deep into Mindy's neck. Blood poured down Mindy's neck and onto her shirt and arms, and then Mindy died. The killer stood up and looked down at Mindy's body. Suddenly, they started to panic. There was so much blood, and Mindy had really fought back. The killer knew they must have left physical evidence on her body, and there were definitely fingerprints on the knife. So the killer darted back into the kitchen and threw open the cabinets under the sink. And there, they found a pair of rubber cleaning gloves and a bottle of pine sol. The killer put on the gloves, grabbed the bottle that was almost full, and went back to Mindy's body. The killer put the bottle down on the floor, then they gripped the knife handle sticking out of Mindy's neck in one hand, and then braced the other hand against Mindy's shoulder, and they broke off the knife handle. Then they pocketed the handle and grabbed the bottle of pine sol. They opened it up and poured it all over Mindy's face, shirt, arms, and legs. When the bottle was empty, the killer just dropped it on the floor next to Mindy. They stood up and walked to the door. The killer cracked open the door and looked out into the hallway to make sure nobody was close by. Then they stepped out into the hall, shutting the door behind them. They turned, they walked down the hall, they turned the corner, and went into their own apartment. Once inside, the killer got rid of the knife handle in the trash and rinsed off their hands and face in the sink. Not long after that, the killer stepped out of their apartment like nothing had happened, and they began heading down to the parking lot to load their car with moving boxes. It would turn out Mo Gibbs, who was Mindy's neighbor and a county jailer, murdered Mindy Morgenstern. Mo had often seen Mindy around the apartment complex, and at times he had even watched her from the shadows. Then, a little over a week before the murder, Mo had helped her hold her laundry while she was able to unlock her door and get inside of her apartment, and it was during that brief interaction that Mo decided he had to have sex with her. But Mo and his fiancée were moving out of the apartment complex soon, and he felt like he had to move fast. So on May 13th, when he saw Mindy doing laundry again, he decided it was time to act. After the murder, Mo had just gone about his business like normal, loading up his car and texting his fiancée. But when he had smelled the strong scent of pine sol, he worried that he might have gone too far, and that the smell might draw attention to the scene. But hours passed without anybody going into Mindy's apartment, and even when Mindy's friend found her body later that night, Mo didn't panic. He just kept going to work, spending time with his fiancée and his daughter, and getting ready to move like everything was fine. But when the DNA test results came in, they pointed investigators directly to Mo. And so Agents Saylor and Dupree started digging into Mo's history, and they discovered he was not the man he said he was. Years before Mindy's murder, he had changed his name to Mo Gibbs, come to Valley City, and taken up an entirely new identity. This had allowed Mo to hide the fact that he had prior convictions when he applied for his job at the county jail. But Mo's past came out when the DNA under Mindy's fingernails matched the samples he had provided, because it also turned out that Mo's DNA samples matched DNA samples found in an unsolved rape case that had taken place years earlier in Fargo, North Dakota. And so police came to believe that Mo had attacked Mindy in her apartment with the intention of ultimately raping her, but when Mindy had fought back so fiercely, Mo abandoned that plan and just killed her. Police arrested Mo, and following his arrest, 6 women came forward and accused him of sexually assaulting them while they were prisoners in the county jail where he worked. And one of those women actually said Mo had sexually assaulted her just hours before Mindy was murdered. Mo Gibbs was found guilty of Mindy's murder, and he pled guilty to 6 counts of rape stemming from the accusations made by the women who had come forward. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are only available on YouTube. Again, that channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Just before dawn on the last Saturday of June 2013, an employee at a Toys R Us store in upstate New York was working in the stockroom when suddenly he heard an alarm going off somewhere inside the store. And so he radioed his manager to turn off the alarm, but the manager didn't respond. And so another employee went to the front office to check on the manager. And when they went inside that office, they would find the manager unconscious and bleeding from a hole in his chest. Meanwhile, the 4 surviving employees who had been there all morning said the store had been locked the whole time, and all 4 of these employees basically didn't see each other the whole time they were there. They were working in different parts of the store. And each of them said they had nothing to do with this and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But when investigators reviewed the security footage from inside the store that morning, they would find something that was very, very suspicious. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's office, break all the lead tips off their pencils, and steal their pencil sharpener. Okay, let's get into today's story. On June 29, 2013, 35-year-old Larry Wells woke up at 3 a.m., slipping out of his bed quietly so he wouldn't wake up his wife. Larry's wife was 3 months pregnant, and raising their 4-year-old daughter was already a full-time job for her, so Larry wanted to be sure that she got all the sleep she needed. After climbing out of bed, Larry slipped into his work clothes that he had laid out the night before, and then he tiptoed through the house out to his car. Larry drove for about 5 minutes through the desolate streets of Hamburg, which is a quiet suburb just outside of Buffalo, New York. And at this hour, pretty much every business in town was closed, so it was very quiet and peaceful. Larry eventually turned into a large parking lot and pulled into a parking space. He got out of his car and began walking toward the big, sprawling building at the center of the lot. And as he walked towards it, he glanced up at the sign above the entrance of the building, and as he looked, he smiled. This sign represented something that had deep roots in Larry's childhood and also now an important place in Larry's adult life. That sign's multicolored letters spelled out Toys R Us. Toys R Us was a very popular toy store chain in the United States at the time, and it's where Larry had worked for the last 7 years. Larry loved kids, and for a while he had wanted to become a teacher. He had actually studied education and even got a master's degree, but after graduate school, he couldn't find a full-time teaching job, so he wound up working as a substitute teacher. But at the time, Larry and his wife wanted to start a family and move into a new house, so that's when Larry decided to get a job working at Toys R Us to supplement his income. At first, Larry thought of his job at Toys R Us as just being a sort of placeholder job, something to have until he got hired on as a full-time teacher somewhere. But it turned out Larry sort of loved working there. He got to regularly interact with children, which he loved doing, and also his fun-loving personality and solid work ethic just made him a perfect fit for the company. And so pretty quickly, Larry took a lot of pride in his job at Toys R Us, and all of his coworkers there adored him, and by the time he and his wife had their first child in 2009, Larry had been promoted to store manager. This was his career. And because Larry cared so much about this job and about Toys R Us, he would often start work at 4 a.m. on Saturday mornings just to help the stockers unload the merchandise trucks, even though he didn't have to do that. And that's exactly what he was doing on this particular Saturday morning, showing up early to lend a helping hand. And so Larry walked up to the front door of the Toys R Us building, and waiting outside were 2 of his employees, Cindy Barone and Isaac Millette Lloyd. The building was locked, so Larry pulled out his keys, unlocked the door, slid it open, and let the 2 workers inside. Larry walked in after them and then slid the door shut and locked it back up, because the store wasn't actually scheduled to open for another several hours. Cindy and Isaac made their way over to the time clock and punched in, then they picked up their walkie-talkies, which they clipped to their belts, and they began their shifts. As for Larry, he headed straight to the storeroom, opened up the back door for the merchandise truck driver, and then began helping the driver unload the truck. And then at some point, Cindy and Isaac came over, and they grabbed pallets of this merchandise from the back, and then wheeled those pallets into the store on dollies. Isaac took his pallet to his section of the store, while Cindy took her merchandise pallet to the next section over. And then both of them got to work restocking the shelves, which had been thinned out by the Friday night rush. By 4:30 a.m., the truck was fully unloaded, so Larry let the driver back out of the building and then locked the back door after him. At this point, Larry, Cindy, and Isaac were now working in separate parts of the building, and they couldn't see each other, but they could communicate using their walkie-talkie radios. And you need to keep in mind that this particular Toys R Us store was massive, over 41,000 square feet. And so really it was normal if you were working in off-hour shifts to basically not see anybody else physically and just basically talk to them on your walkie-talkie. A little before 5 a.m., so about 30 minutes later, an employee named Anthony Armstrong stood outside the front entrance, pulled out his cell phone, and called his manager, Larry, and told him he was outside the store ready to start his shift and could he come over and unlock the door. And so Larry made his way to the front door, he opened it up, let Anthony inside, and then slid the door shut and locked it back up. About 10 minutes after that, another employee named Richard Shepard approached the front door of the Toys R Us and also called Larry so he could be let in the building. But this time, Larry's phone just rang several times and went to voicemail. So Richard sent Larry a text message and then waited a minute for a reply, hoping he would reply soon, but he didn't. And so as Richard is just sort of standing there, he pressed his face against the glass and peered into the store to look for any movement, thinking maybe he could, bang on the door and get one of the other employees' attention so they could let him in. But he didn't see anybody. So feeling sort of frustrated, Richard stepped away from the door and walked east towards the Babies R Us side of the building, which had a separate entrance from the main store. And when he got there, he found one of the sliding doors at Babies R Us was wide open. Now, this really surprised Richard because the company had very strict loss prevention policies that required all doors to remain locked during non-business hours. But this was actually kind of lucky for him because now he was able to just stroll right into the store without needing anyone to help him inside. And so once he was in, Richard clocked in and began his shift stocking shelves in his section. Now, at this point, Richard still hadn't seen anybody else. And he did think it was kind of eerie to be all alone in this vast fluorescent-lit store before the sun had even come up. A few sections over from Richard, Isaac was still stocking his shelves, and he was taking his time as usual because Isaac was meticulous and took great pride in his work. He also really liked Larry as a manager, and so he always tried to do a really good job when Larry was around because he wanted to impress Larry. Cindy, on the other hand, was actually almost done stocking her section. But it wasn't because she was lazy, it was because she had worked at Toys R Us longer than a lot of the other employees, and so she knew the merchandise inside and out, and she could basically make her way through the entire giant store with her eyes closed, and so she was just really quick. As the hour wore on, all the employees kept plugging away, sort of independent of each other, and outside, as the sky turned from pitch black to a pale blue as the sun rose, the lights in the parking lot switched off for the day. Isaac looked outside and noticed the sun coming up, and he knew the store was going to be opening in just a couple of hours, and he still had more merchandise that he would need to put out onto the shelves. So he wheeled his now empty pallet to the back of the store into the stockroom, and he was about to load up another full pallet of merchandise when he suddenly heard a noise coming from inside the store. It was a repetitive noise, like a wailing sound, but sort of flat and robotic. At first, just because Isaac didn't know what the sound was, he simply tried to ignore it and just focus on his work. But the sound just kept going on, and nobody seemed to be turning it off, and that's when Isaac realized this was actually an alarm going off inside the store. And so Isaac stopped what he was doing, and he pulled out his radio, and he pressed the button and said, "Hey Larry, there's an alarm going off in the store, can you please turn it off?" But a minute went by, and the alarm still kept going, and there were no responses from Larry on the radio. And so Isaac turned the channel on his radio and radioed everyone in the store and asked for someone to please go find Larry and please get him to turn off that alarm. Cindy happened to be closest to the manager's office at the front of the store when Isaac made this radio call, and so Cindy replied into the radio that she would go see if Larry was in his office. Shortly after that, Isaac emerged from the stockroom, pulling behind him a pallet of merchandise, and as he did, suddenly a woman's scream echoed through the entire store, and then Isaac heard this woman sobbing and shouting, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" Isaac had never heard Cindy scream or cry before, so at first, he wasn't even sure if it was her. He just felt completely disoriented. And then Isaac saw his coworker Anthony rushing towards the manager's office, and so Isaac followed behind. Outside the office, both men saw Cindy crying and shaking, and in between sobs, she said she needed to call 911, and then she rushed past them, picked up a phone from one of the checkout lanes, and dialed. At this point, Richard, the employee who had shown up last, rushed up the aisle to where Isaac and Anthony were now standing, and the three men just sort of looked at each other, confused and frightened, and then, without a better plan, they just walked into the manager's office, and immediately it became clear why Cindy was so upset. Their manager, Larry, was slumped over in his chair, bleeding profusely from a hole in his chest. Isaac reflexively called out to Larry, but Larry didn't respond. The only sound in the office was a loud pulsing screech from the phone receiver, which had been left off the hook. And so the three men just turned and ran out of the office over to Cindy, who by this point was on the phone with 911, totally hysterical, screaming into the phone that their manager had been shot and she wasn't sure if he was alive or dead. The Hamburg Police Department received word from dispatch of a shooting with a possible active shooter scenario at the Toys R Us, and so every police unit in town busted a U-turn and sped in their cruisers straight for the store. Now, the 911 operator had told Cindy that the police were going to be there soon, and so everybody in the store needed to exit immediately and wait in the parking lot. So minutes later, the police arrived at the store, they saw the four employees outside waiting for them, and so after moving the employees across the street to a safe location, the police went inside the store ready to potentially engage with an active shooter, because nobody knew for sure what the situation really was. Was there still an armed shooter inside somewhere? Or maybe had they left the store and they were on the loose in the area? Nobody knew. Detective Sergeant Scott Cascino was still at home and barely awake when he got the call about the shooting. And he found himself feeling totally confused and wondering if he had even heard correctly. Like, the idea that there was a shooting inside of a Toys R Us at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning in Hamburg, of all places, just seemed impossible. Cascino was a veteran detective who knew that the town of Hamburg had very little violent crime. So as he quickly got dressed and hopped into his police-issued vehicle and drove to the Toys R Us, he really didn't know what to expect. When Cascino arrived at Toys R Us and parked his car in the lot, he watched as the other police officers who had already arrived began carefully advancing towards the building with their guns drawn. Those officers would slowly make their way through the store looking for anybody, but finding no one, before finally getting to the manager's office, where they went inside and they saw what Cindy had seen. Larry, all alone inside, slumped over in his chair. The police called out Larry's name several times, but he was unresponsive. One of the officers walked over to him and pressed his fingers into Larry's wrist, and he turned to his colleagues and signaled that Larry did still have a pulse. But the officers saw all the blood on the floor and they could barely hear Larry's breathing, and so they agreed they basically had no time to waste here in getting this man medical attention. And so the officers just grabbed Larry by the shoulders and dragged him out of his office, through the store, and out the front door, right to a waiting ambulance. 2 EMTs lifted Larry onto a gurney, they strapped him down, and then placed him into the back of the ambulance, and then the EMTs hopped in with him, closed the doors, and the ambulance sped off towards the hospital. And as that ambulance sped across town, the EMTs in the back worked on Larry, trying to compress the wound in his chest and get the bleeding to stop. The EMTs noticed that in addition to the huge hole in Larry's chest, there was another wound in his shoulder, but comparatively speaking, it was not nearly as big of a deal as the chest wound. And then as the EMTs continued doing their work, they realized, these wounds were not gunshot wounds, they were knife wounds. Larry had been stabbed. However, despite all the efforts made by these EMTs to try to save Larry, he would unfortunately pass away from his wounds when they were only about halfway to the hospital. Back at the Toys R Us, police had set up a perimeter around the property, and then the SWAT team arrived. The SWAT team then searched both inside and outside the building, and then reported to Detective Cascino that they didn't find anything or anyone that was suspicious, and so at this point, all investigators were clear to now enter the building. It was also around this time that Detective Cascino and the rest of the first responders learned that the victim had died on the way to the hospital, and that contrary to what the initial theory had been, that he had not been shot, he had been stabbed to death. Cascino and crime scene investigators proceeded into the Toys R Us and headed directly into the manager's office, where Larry had been found. Once inside, everything was carefully swabbed for DNA and dusted for fingerprints, and as they did this, investigators were careful not to step in the long streak of Larry's blood that had been left there on the ground when the police had dragged him out. There was also a security DVR on the table. It was where footage from all the store's security cameras was fed and recorded onto a hard drive. And very clearly, the power cord to that security DVR had been unplugged and pulled away from the wall. Kashino had a hunch that one of the employees who had been working that morning was Larry's killer, and the footage from the surveillance cameras around the property may very well reveal which one it was. So getting this DVR connected and reviewing the footage on it from the surveillance cameras would be crucial. At this point, the 4 employees who had been there that morning, Cindy, Isaac, Anthony, and Richard, were the primary suspects in this murder, and so Kashino and his team quickly separated them so they could all be interviewed individually. Investigators put Isaac in the passenger seat of one of the police cruisers, and Kashino sat in the car with him. And the first thing Kashino noticed was how Isaac was trembling and tripping over his words. And so Isaac's nervousness and his inability to answer questions clearly made him seem suspicious, and so did the behavior of Anthony Armstrong, who was the youngest member of the employee crew. He completely clammed up during his interview and refused to answer questions, so that raised a red flag too. Then, detectives questioned Cindy, who was the one who actually found Larry's body, and she was cooperative and helped investigators develop a timeline for the events of the morning, but critically, during her interview, she made it very clear that Anthony was the last person to see Larry alive. Then, investigators learned that the final employee, Richard Shepard, was late for work that morning. And when detectives asked him why, Richard explained that he had stopped at the 24-hour grocery store to buy a drink and some snacks to help him get through his shift. Richard then recounted that when he had gotten to work that morning, he had tried calling Larry to open the door for him, but there was no response, and so he wound up entering through another door, the Babies R Us door, that just happened to be wide open. And then Richard explained that, that in and of itself was very unusual, because they were all under strict orders to keep the doors locked at all times during non-business hours. And so the investigators finished up their initial interviews with the 4 Toys R Us employees who were there that morning, but they told them they would still need to stick around a bit longer. At about noon, the Toys R Us regional manager of loss prevention for the area, Bernie Grusha, came out to the store. Toys R Us corporate had contacted him and sent him out here to try to be as helpful as possible with the investigation. Kashino saw Grusha arrive, walked over and introduced himself, and then a few minutes later asked Grusha to come into the manager's office to try to help the investigators view the store's security footage. Once inside the office, Grusha just plugged the DVR back into the wall and then got the system up and running. Kashino looked at his notes and saw that Cindy said she had arrived at the store shortly before 4 a.m. So Kashino asked Grusha to please wind the security footage back to about 3:45 a.m. And so Grusha pulled up the security video at 3:45 a.m., and then very slowly, the detectives began examining footage from each of the store's more than a dozen security cameras from 3:45 onward. And as they did this, Kashino, who was right nearby, pulled out his notebook and began writing down the exact time at which he saw the employees show up at work on this video, and then he compared the security footage timestamp to the timelines that each of the employees had given him. And also, Kashino took note of where in the store specifically each employee was working during the first 2 hours of their shifts. On the video, Kashino saw Larry, Isaac, and Cindy all entering the store at 3:55 a.m. And then a few minutes later, Larry could be seen in the back of the store, letting that truck driver inside the building so they could offload merchandise. And then, at exactly 4:24 a.m., Kashino noticed some movement from the camera inside of the Babies R Us department that was pointed toward the front door of the building. And so Kashino asked Grusha to please bring that specific video into full frame. And once that video was maximized, the investigators saw a dark figure standing right outside the front door to Babies R Us for about 30 seconds. This figure appeared to struggle with the lock before the door suddenly opened and they walked inside and disappeared somewhere inside the store. Kashino turned to Grusha and said it sort of looked like the person in the video had jimmied or pried the door open, and Grusha agreed. Kashino directed Grusha to pull up the global view, which would allow them to see all of the cameras at once. This would let them track this mysterious figure's movements through the store. The investigators watched on the global view as this figure disappeared from one camera's view and then popped up in another. But as they watched, it became pretty clear that this person was doing their best to avoid being in front of the cameras. They were snaking and dodging their way through the store, hiding behind shelves wherever they could. I mean, they were acting really sketchy. But more than that, what seemed really apparent to Kashino and Grusha and the other investigators was that this person on the video camera clearly seemed to know the layout of the store and exactly where the hidden cameras inside the building were positioned. At one point, when the intruder walked across one of the camera's field of vision and was relatively easy to see, Kashino asked Grusha to pause the camera and zoom in on this person to get a better look. And as soon as Grusha did this, it was clear to investigators that this person was trying very hard to disguise their identity. The figure had this dark thing wrapped around their face like a scarf. They had all dark clothing on, including dark sweatpants with lettering down the left pant leg, and they were wearing a two-toned baseball cap. But by far the most chilling thing about this figure was what they appeared to be holding in their right hand. It looked very much like they were carrying a large knife. But despite all this, the security video was grainy and low resolution, especially zoomed in, so nobody in the room could make out any of the figure's facial features. The investigators couldn't even make out if this was a man or a woman, and it was also impossible to tell what the lettering on the side of their sweatpants said. And so eventually, Grusha zoomed back out and resumed playing the footage, and everyone in the room watched as this mysterious figure made their way to the front of the store. They moved along the front wall, and then at exactly 4:32 a.m., the figure entered the manager's office. And shortly after that, the security video cut out. And so the running assumption amongst the investigators was that, this intruder must have pulled the plug on the DVR, and that's why it cut. Kashino asked Grusha to rewind the surveillance footage and play it back from the point that figure entered the store. They cycled through the video again, and then once more, slowing it down and zooming in on the intruder again. And eventually, it dawned on one of the investigators that the two-tone baseball cap the figure was seen wearing in the footage looked an awful lot like the Florida Gators hat that had been left behind on the floor inside of the office. And so this confirmed for detectives that that hat they had found had very likely been worn by the killer, and it was, along with this surveillance footage, possibly the most valuable piece of evidence that they had. Once they were finished viewing the surveillance footage, Kashino unplugged the power cord and then carefully bagged it into evidence, because he now knew that the killer had very likely yanked it from the wall. Then Kashino handed off the power cord, along with that hat they had found, to crime scene technicians, who prepared these items to be transported back to the crime lab to be swabbed for DNA. 2 days after Larry's murder, the whole community of Hamburg was still frightened because the killer had not been caught. But by this time, the yellow police tape had been pulled from the perimeter of the Toys R Us, and the store was now open for business and crowded with customers. Police also released the surveillance video and images of the baseball cap to the news media on the off chance that somebody in the area might recognize the killer's walk or maybe the clothing they were wearing. Meanwhile, back at the crime lab, technicians had swabbed the DVR power cord and the Florida Gators baseball cap, and they were able to develop what they believed was the killer's DNA profile. They uploaded that DNA profile into CODIS, which is the federal DNA database with loads and loads of DNA profiles. However, after it was uploaded, there was no match. So at this point, the investigators, which now included the FBI, made it their main objective to collect DNA samples from every employee of the Hamburg Toys R Us store, both current employees and former employees, because many, if not all of these people, would not be in the CODIS database. And remember, the leading theory at this point is that, Larry was killed by potentially an active employee or a former employee, somebody with access to this building and an understanding of where the cameras were. And so over the course of the next few weeks, investigators developed a list of Toys R Us past and present employees and also other people connected to Larry and began making contact with them. Police interviewed literally hundreds of people, and not one person they talked to could think of anyone who would have done this. Seemingly nobody had any issues with Larry Wells. And on top of that, it was like nobody had one unkind thing to say about him. He seemed universally loved. But there was one piece of information that surfaced from a witness who had been near the Toys R Us in the early hours of the morning that Larry was killed. And that person recalled seeing a black Chevy Impala sedan parked inside the toy store's parking lot at that time. Now, this Toys R Us, despite having loads of cameras, did not have any dedicated exterior cameras, so there were no images of this vehicle, and this witness did not get a license plate number for the car. Police also could not immediately trace a black Chevy Impala to any of the Toys R Us employees. And so, while some members of the investigative team searched for this car without much to go on, others continued to track down and collect DNA swabs from current and former employees of the Hamburg Toys R Us, and they ended up with a total of 47 DNA samples. It would take several weeks for each DNA profile to be processed by the crime lab, but finally, in mid-August, a month and a half after Larry's murder, the results from all 47 DNA tests came in. And none were a match, meaning not one of those current or former employees had a DNA profile that matched the DNA profile from the hat and the power cord found inside of the crime scene. Detective Cascino and his team were frankly shocked. I mean, they expected there to be a match here, but now they just felt lost. It was like months of work had gotten them nowhere. And so once again, they turned to the FBI for help, and they asked the Bureau to draw up a psychological and personality profile of the killer. And so the FBI created that profile and then began reviewing recent arrests in the upstate New York area, and they would find one person who matched their profile almost exactly. The man's name was Patrick Walden, and he had recently been arrested in a neighboring town, and he had just been released from jail. And Cascino soon learned that the vehicle Patrick was driving when he was arrested was registered to his girlfriend's mother, who happened to be an employee at the Hamburg Toys R Us where Larry Wells was killed. And perhaps even more importantly, Cascino discovered that when police searched that vehicle at the time of Patrick's arrest, inside of the car, they found a very long knife. Detective Cascino and the rest of the investigation now considered Patrick to be their primary suspect. He had a connection to the Toys R Us through his girlfriend's mother, he'd been in possession of a weapon that was at least similar to the one used to kill Larry, and he fit the FBI's profile of the killer. So Cascino quickly secured a warrant to put around-the-clock surveillance on Patrick. And on an afternoon, not long after that, an undercover cop tailed Patrick as he drove through town. The undercover cop made sure to stay far enough back not to draw any attention, and he followed Patrick for several minutes, almost at a leisurely pace. Then, the cop noticed Patrick's driver's side window roll down, and so sensing an opportunity here, the cop sped up a bit and leaned forward in his car to get a better look inside of Patrick's car, and he saw Patrick throw something out of the open window onto the street. Now, the cop had no idea what it was, but there was no way he was going to miss this opportunity. And so instead of continuing to trail Patrick, the cop pulled over to the side of the road, he got out, he walked into the middle of the road, being careful of oncoming traffic, and he began looking at the ground for whatever it was Patrick threw, and he couldn't believe his luck, because right there in the middle of the road was a still smoldering cigarette butt, something Patrick had just been smoking. And so it would definitely have a sample of Patrick's DNA on it. And so the undercover cop slipped on a pair of gloves, he crouched down, picked up the butt, carefully extinguished it, dropped it into an evidence bag, and headed back to his vehicle. The cigarette butt was sent to the crime lab for processing, and Detective Cascino and his team thought that was going to be a huge break in the case. But as with all the other DNA samples police had collected to that point, Cascino knew it would still take weeks before test results came back. And during that time, the local news started running stories about how the investigation still hadn't caught the killer, and about how people in the community were tense, feeling as though anyone among them could be the killer. And on top of that, Larry's widow was now more than 5 months pregnant with the couple's second daughter, who would be born without a father. And Larry's widow and the rest of Larry's family feared that the investigation was really losing momentum. And so Cascino was feeling a ton of pressure to crack this case. So while he and his team waited for DNA results on the cigarette butt, they went back to the beginning, reviewing their case files and looking for anything they might have overlooked. And it was at that point that investigators realized there was still one Toys R Us employee on their list that they actually had not obtained a DNA sample from. In fact, every time they had contacted this particular employee to request a sample, this person had an excuse as to why it wasn't a good time. They were either out of town, attending a family event, or just feeling under the weather. And the more time that passed, the more it seemed like this employee was actually deliberately trying to avoid giving their DNA sample. So detectives reached out to this person again and said, hey, we got to do this sample. But once again, the employee said, no, it was not a good time. They said they were still very distraught over everything that had happened. And so for the time being, they had gone to stay at their father's house, so they were not around to give the sample. Kashino and his team believed that they had already been patient enough with this employee and that the employee's evasiveness was really starting to look quite suspicious. So the investigators located this employee's father's house, and they drove out there hoping to basically force this employee to give a DNA sample. And so the investigators made their way out to this house, they parked outside, got out of their vehicles, and began walking up towards the door. And as they passed by a car that was parked in the driveway, one of the investigators stopped in his tracks. He called out to the others and waved them over to the car he was next to, and then he pointed to something on the rear bumper. It was a Florida Gators bumper sticker. And remember, there was a Florida Gators hat found in the crime scene. That's where the DNA sample was being pulled from. When Kashino saw this, he felt a jolt of excitement. He felt like this could be a big break. And so he and the others walked up to the front door and they knocked, and the employee they were trying to get this DNA sample from answered, appearing very surprised to see the investigators at their father's house. But Kashino was very disarming, and he apologized for bothering them. And he said, look, I know this is not a good time, but the police department really needs to get their DNA right now, just so they can eliminate them from the suspect pool. The employee nodded and said they understood, and then Kashino handed them a swab and asked them to please put it in their mouth and swab their cheek. The employee did that and handed the swab right back, and Kashino dropped it into a plastic vial and sealed it inside. The investigators thanked the employee, then they returned to their vehicles and drove back to the station. Once there, they handed over the swab to the crime lab, but they knew, just like with the Patrick Walden swab and all the others, they would have to wait weeks before this result would come back. While they waited, no major new leads developed. The only thing that came up was investigators learned that Isaac, the employee whose anxiousness had raised suspicions right after the murder, quit his job at Toys R Us, but that didn't really lead the police anywhere. Then finally, in the middle of October, DNA test results came back for Patrick Walden, who had thrown that cigarette butt out the window that the undercover had found, and also for the final Toys R Us employee that police had to go to his father's house to collect that swab for. And one of those two DNA profiles would be a match for the DNA that was found on the Florida Gators hat and the security DVR power cord. And so, more than 3 months after Larry Wells was murdered, Detective Kashino and his team now knew what happened inside the Toys R Us on that Saturday morning in June. And they knew the identity of that figure in the grainy surveillance footage. Based on interviews, DNA samples, and evidence collected throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened at the Toys R Us on June 29, 2013. In the dark, early morning hours, the killer drove a black Chevy Impala into the Toys R Us parking lot. They parked the vehicle and then just sat there, scoping out the closed store and planning their entry. After a few minutes, the killer pulled a scarf around their face to conceal their identity. They grabbed their knife off the passenger seat and then got out of their car and walked up to the Babies R Us entrance on the side of the store. The killer walked up to the entrance and then kind of jostled at the door for about 30 seconds until they got it open, and then they went inside. Once inside, they very carefully walked along the walls, ducking behind shelves and doing their best to hide from the store surveillance cameras. The killer eventually reached the manager's office, and they walked inside and closed the door behind them. The killer then walked over to the DVR surveillance system and pulled the power cord out of the wall, disabling all the cameras in the store. 15 minutes later, store manager Larry Wells entered that very same office and right away saw the killer crouched over, attempting to open up the store safe. The killer heard Larry enter and they wheeled around and immediately held up their knife and demanded Larry come over here and open the safe. But Larry, instead of doing that, just reached for the phone to call for help. But at the same time, the killer lunged at Larry and the two men began to struggle. Larry tried desperately to push the killer off of him, but the killer began swinging their arms wildly, at one point stabbing Larry in the shoulder. And when that happened, Larry stumbled forward, and the killer at that point just raised the knife again and brought it down into Larry, stabbing him in the left side of his chest. Larry screamed out in pain and then collapsed into the chair. The killer just stood there for a second, shocked at the sight of Larry now bleeding profusely from the stab wound they had just inflicted on him. And so the killer, who was starting to panic, just forgot about the safe and just turned and ran out of the office, not realizing their baseball cap had fallen off during the attack. Once out of the office, the killer slipped through the store unseen and rushed back outside. They got back into their Impala, sped out of the parking lot, and tossed the knife into a dumpster as they fled the scene. Back in the manager's office, Larry Wells was slipping in and out of consciousness. But in one of his conscious moments, he did manage to trip the store alarm. However, despite that alarm going off, Larry would lay there bleeding for nearly an hour before he was finally discovered and help was called. But unfortunately, by that point, it was already too late. For months, detectives had dealt with one DNA test after another that did not match the hat or the DVR cord. But they did finally get a match from that last employee they had tested, and that employee was Bernie Grusha, the regional vice president of loss prevention for Toys R Us, and the same man who had assisted investigators with the security footage. He literally watched himself maneuver through the store, eventually committing a murder while he sat there with police. On October 16, 2013, police arrested Grusha and charged him with the murder of his friend and employee, Larry Wells. Investigators served a search warrant on Grusha's home, and what they found in the garage of the house brought them much closer to understanding his motives. Police found over $200,000 in stolen Toys R Us merchandise. And what the investigation would soon uncover is that Bernie Grusha, who had been hired to protect Toys R Us assets, was actually robbing Toys R Us blind. He had stolen merchandise from numerous Toys R Us stores in New York and Pennsylvania, and he was then reselling this merchandise on eBay to help chip away at his mountain of debt while continuing to live a lifestyle that was way beyond his means. Investigators learned that his wife became fed up with Grusha's reckless spending, and she also discovered that he was cheating on her, and so their marriage was falling apart. And just 3 weeks before Larry Wells' murder, Grusha had had this argument with his wife, after which he had left the room, ran upstairs, entered the master bedroom, got out his 9mm Beretta pistol, and fired it. And his wife ran upstairs and found her husband lying face down on the floor, thinking he must have killed himself, and so she frantically ran to him and turned him over, at which point he looked back at her, completely unharmed, and told her he just wanted to test her and see how she'd react. His wife reacted by calling the police, who quickly showed up, confiscated the gun, and placed Grusha under arrest on charges of criminal possession of a weapon and harassment. His wife then filed a protection order, and so Grusha could not return to the house that he shared with his family. So he went to live with his father as his life continued to fall apart. Grusha had reached a point of total desperation by the time he parked the black Chevy Impala in the Toys R Us parking lot that morning in late June, before taking the life of a man he had hired and considered his friend. It turned out Grusha had rented that black Chevy Impala, and when he arrived back at the store later to assist investigators, he was driving his own car. But police were able to trace that rental car back to him, which further solidified their case. Investigators also discovered that Grusha had actually used his key to unlock the Babies R Us door. He had simply pretended to be prying it open for the security cameras, because he figured that would point investigators to a lower-ranking employee or someone who did not work at the store at all. Grusha eventually admitted to everything he had done in exchange for a reduced sentence. He claimed he did not intend to kill Larry Wells that morning, that he had gone in there to commit a robbery, and then things had simply got out of control, and he had stabbed Larry while flailing about with his knife in his hand. Prosecutors knew there was no way they could prove intent, so they ended up reducing the murder charge to just first-degree manslaughter. And so Bernie Grusha pled guilty and was sentenced to a minimum term of 25 years in prison. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Not just this one, but also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Run Fool, and Wartime Stories. To find them, all you have to do is look up Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and boom, you'll find them all. If you want to watch hundreds more stories just like the one you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. The man's cousin had been gunned down just 2 days earlier in a horrible double homicide that shocked the little town of Mountain City, Tennessee. And now, on February 2nd, 2012, the detectives wanted this man's help. But the man just slouched down in his chair, muttering one-word answers and never even taking off his sunglasses. So eventually, the detectives just stopped asking questions and just stared at the man, waiting for him to talk when he was ready. And at some point, the man did talk. But he said something that didn't make any sense. He sat up suddenly and looked all around the room like somebody was watching him, and then he looked at the two detectives, and he said very quietly, "Is the CIA here?" The detectives had no idea why the American spy agency would be interested in a Tennessee murder case, but now they needed to find out. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to take the Amazon Music follow button out to the movies, and then while you're there, be sure to sprinkle an entire handful of sand onto their popcorn, but tell them it's salt. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was after 11 p.m. on January 30th, 2012, when Billy Payne Jr. got a call. A buddy of his wanted to come to his house in Mountain City, Tennessee to buy some drugs. But Billy didn't appreciate getting that call. Sure, Billy was a small-time drug dealer, but he wasn't the crazy bachelor he used to be a few years earlier. He was 36, and he had a family now, including a 6-month-old son who had finally fallen asleep. And so the last thing Billy needed was a late-night visitor to wake the baby up again. So at 11:30, he texted his friends saying they couldn't meet up. He explained he had to be up early in the morning for his job at the thread factory, and so he needed some rest. His friend would just have to get his pills somewhere else. But as much as this call was annoying because it was inconveniencing, the truth was Billy was actually in the process of trying to leave his drug-abusing past behind. Billy had always been the life of the party in his small town. He was the guy who always had a beer in his hand and an endless parade of girlfriends. He drove a Mustang and bragged about going to Las Vegas for the weekend. His cousin, Jamie Curd, described Billy as being a man with caviar tastes on a working man's budget. But all that high living had a price. Billy had developed a nasty addiction to opioid painkillers, an addiction that he supported in part by selling opioids himself. Billy knew he'd made his share of mistakes in his life, including the fact that he had a young son in Florida that he never saw, but his opioid addiction was the worst. It clouded his judgment, it sucked up his money, and always left him feeling desperate for more. After Billy finished texting his friend, telling him not to come over, he went to go peek in on his baby, Tyler, who was all tucked into his crib. Billy smiled at the baby, and then he headed down the hall to join his girlfriend, Billie Jean Hayworth, in bed. Billie Jean was 13 years younger than Billy, and she was slender and pretty, with short brown hair. She was also an outdoorsy Tennessee girl who loved nothing better than fishing, hiking, and camping. Billy had had his eye on Billie Jean from the moment she had come to work on the cleaning crew at the thread factory 3 years earlier. And soon after they had met, the two started spending all their time together. By 2010, Billy had invited Billie Jean to move into the small one-bathroom house that he shared with his father. By 2011, Billie Jean was pregnant with Billy's child. That same year, Billy had begun going religiously to an opioid treatment center and taking a prescription drug to control his cravings. And while the new year was still only a few weeks old, Billy still had a feeling that this year, 2012, would be the year he could finally start calling himself a former opioid addict. Billy felt grateful as he looked down at his sleeping girlfriend, but he didn't look for long. He was really tired, and as soon as he laid down and his head hit the pillow, he fell asleep. But parents of infants rarely get to sleep for very long. and just after 5 a.m., baby Tyler started wailing from his crib. Billie Jean wearily swung her feet out of the bed and onto the floor, and then set off down the hall to try to calm the baby down. Billy woke up to all the commotion, and he lay there quietly, listening to the sounds of Billie Jean heating up a bottle for Tyler. He could also hear another voice out in the kitchen. It was his father. Sometimes the house felt a bit cramped, with all of them living there together, but it filled Billy with happiness to watch his father hold little Tyler. After a few minutes, Billy heard Billie Jean changing the baby's diaper, and he heard his father saying goodbye and leaving for work. Then Billy felt Billie Jean slide back into bed next to him, and then he began to nod off again, even though he knew the alarm would soon wake him up. And it was at this point that Billy heard the sound of the sliding glass side door open. Just for a moment, he thought maybe his father must have forgotten something and come back. But then a shadowy figure suddenly loomed in the bedroom doorway, standing there completely silent and still. And even in the darkness, he could tell this was not his father. Billy suddenly was terrified, and he managed to blurt out, "What the hell?" And then everything went black. Less than an hour later, at 6:25 a.m., a friend of Billy's pulled into Billy's driveway, just like he always did on weekdays. He worked at the thread factory with Billy, and they usually carpooled. From outside, the friend could see that Billy and Billie Jean's bedroom light was on, but the friend didn't want to burst in, so he sent Billy a text, asking if he was going to work today. When Billy didn't respond, his friend went around the side of the house, and then went into the house through the sliding glass door that Billy and Billie Jean always left unlocked. He called out for Billy, but got no answer, so he used the family's landline phone in the living room to call Billy's cell phone twice. But each time, no one picked up. But just then, the friend wondered if maybe the reason Billy and Billie Jean were not responding to him was because they were sharing a private, intimate moment in their bedroom, and basically the friend had walked in on them. And so out of respect, the friend just stopped what he was doing, left the house, and figured, Billy would be in touch at some point. Almost 4 hours later, another family friend, whose name was Roy Stevens, came to Billy and Billie Jean's house to pick up some mail that Billy and Billie Jean were holding for him. And just like the friend from earlier, Roy also ended up going into their house through the unlocked glass sliding door and began calling out for Billie Jean and Billy. And when no one responded, Roy walked down the hall to the couple's bedroom and went inside. And what he saw gave him the shock of his life. Billy was lying on his back on the bed, not moving and covered in blood. Roy ran to Billy and shook his arm, but it was useless. Billy was totally lifeless. Roy began screaming, "No, no, no," over and over and over again. Then he rushed outside and yelled for his wife, who was waiting in the car, to call 911. Then Roy went back inside, and he would make an even more shocking discovery. He heard a murmur coming from the baby's bedroom, and when he went into that bedroom, he saw Billie Jean lying on the floor in a pool of blood. And there in her arms was her baby, breathing but asleep. The baby's forehead was smeared with their mother's blood. Roy couldn't believe what he was looking at, but he just reached down and scooped up the child, and then ran out of the house as fast as he could. Minutes later, paramedics reached the house, but there wasn't anything they could do for Billy and Billie Jean. The EMTs said the couple had likely been dead for hours. This was now a job for homicide detectives. Agent Scott Lott, a veteran detective with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, was one of the first law enforcement officials on the scene, and he began photographing everything he saw. He knew immediately that this was not your typical East Tennessee murder that grew out of an alcohol-fueled argument or a domestic dispute. This was something more sinister. It looked like Billy had been shot with a single bullet before he could even get out of bed, and he also had this deep gash on his throat. Lott left the bedroom and walked down the hall to the nursery, and he saw Billie Jean lying on the floor by her baby's crib. She had also been shot with a single bullet. Lott knew she had to have been killed while she was clutching her baby, and the thought of that was so disturbing and just so sad. Lott got down on his hands and knees and began to look for the actual bullet that killed Billie Jean, and he found it lodged in the baby's bouncy seat. Lott was amazed that the baby had somehow been left unhurt in all of this carnage. Aside from the murder victims themselves, Lott felt like the house seemed remarkably undisturbed. There was no sign of a struggle or a robbery or destruction of Billy and Billie Jean's property. Whoever committed these murders was very clean and efficient. After Lott's initial search of the house, he walked outside and waited for Billy's father to come home. Billy's father choked back sobs when he came roaring up to the house in his truck. He had gotten a call from a sheriff's deputy telling him what had happened at his house. He stepped out of the truck, and Detective Lott went over to meet him. Billy's father told Lott that everything had seemed perfectly normal when he left that morning. Billie Jean had been feeding the baby in the pre-dawn darkness, and he was getting ready for work. And now, just a few hours later, his whole property was marked off with yellow police tape, and his son and his son's girlfriend were dead. The old man just couldn't make any sense of it. But as Lott listened to Billy's distraught father, it dawned on him that the killer or killers must have planned the attack in great detail. Billy's dad said he left for work at 5:30 a.m., and Billy needed to go to work an hour later. That left only 1 hour when Billy and Billie Jean would have been home alone with the baby. Lott thought the chances were good that the killer or killers had been waiting in the dark outside the house for their opportunity to attack this young couple, and the thought of that just made Lott's skin crawl. By 2 p.m., the detectives were ready to release the bodies to the morgue for autopsy, and Lott was eager to start talking to people who knew the victims. His investigators had combed every square inch of the house and learned almost nothing from it. Lott didn't know whether he was dealing with a drug cartel hit or a serial killer or something else entirely. That afternoon, Lott and his partner, Chief Deputy Joe Woodard, asked one of Billie Jean's closest friends, Lindsay Thomas, to come down to the Mountain City Sheriff's Station. They hoped she might be able to provide some information about Billie Jean that could help the investigation. Lindsay had clearly been crying, but she came to the station ready to help find the killer or killers, even if that meant telling some of her friends' secrets. Lindsay said she suspected that the murders had something to do with drugs. She had visited Billie Jean at home the day before the killings, and Billie Jean had told her that she was selling opioid pills to help pay for Tyler's baby supplies. And Lindsay knew that Billie Jean's boyfriend, Billy, also sold opioid pills. And so Lindsay told Lott that between the two of them, they could have been in touch with some very dangerous people who would not hesitate to hurt or even kill them if something went wrong. This was news to Lott. Billy and Billie Jean did not have criminal records, and they were not under investigation by the narcotics squad either. But maybe the couple was just good at avoiding unwanted attention. The crime scene was certainly consistent with a ruthless drug gang hit, cold, efficient, and cruel, and Lott did find white crystals on the floor in Tyler's room that looked a lot like methamphetamines. And so Lott made a mental note to be sure to check back in with his narcotics squad. Then, Lott asked about something Billy's dad had told him. When Billy's dad was sobbing in front of the house, he had made a comment about how there was some bad blood between his son and his son's girlfriend and this other family in town, the Potters. Now, Billy's father was too upset to explain this clearly, but from what Lott gathered, it sounded like there was some sort of internet feud between primarily Billie Jean and Janelle Potter, who was 30 years old and lived with her parents. Lindsay told detectives that she knew all about this feud. She said she'd even gotten caught up in it. But she thought the whole thing was just stupid. It was more like a middle school food fight than a reason to actually kill someone, and so Billy and Billie Jean were not afraid of the Potter family. I mean, they never even locked all their doors. Still, Lott asked Lindsay to slow down and walk the detectives through the entire feud. Lindsay said the dispute had begun more than a year earlier when people that she had never heard of began slamming her and Billie Jean on a website called Topics. It was a site where people commented on local issues, sometimes anonymously. One person had accused Lindsay of threatening to hurt Janelle, and he said that Janelle's defenders might hurt Lindsay too. And so he warned Lindsay to, quote, watch her back. For months, Topics users alleged that Lindsay and Billie Jean were out to get Janelle, and that they might even physically assault her. Lindsay told the detectives that she and Billie Jean had tried to ignore the taunts because the whole idea was absurd. The two women barely knew Janelle and really had no reason to want to hurt her. Lindsay said that she and Billie Jean ultimately became convinced that Janelle Potter herself was orchestrating the social media posts against them as a way to make herself look like a victim and maybe get some sympathy. Lindsay explained that Janelle was a very immature person who had never had a job, never had a driver's license, or really a real boyfriend, so she had plenty of time to stir up some trouble. Lindsay said that she and Billie Jean eventually filed harassment charges against Janelle, but a judge threw out their complaints for lack of evidence. After that, Billy got involved, and he called Janelle's mother in hopes of ending the dispute. But the mother stood by her daughter, and before long, the phone call had turned into a shouting match, with Janelle crying in the background. Lott looked over at his partner Woodard, and he nodded. They both knew this was a strange lead, but it was the best thing they had so far, so they had to go talk to the Potters next. The next morning, so February 1st, the two detectives drove out to the Potters' home, located a few miles from where Billy and Billie Jean had lived and died. Janelle's father, Buddy, opened the front door even before Lott and Woodard could ring the doorbell. He would tell them that he'd actually been expecting them because everybody in town always pointed fingers at his family. Lott could see that Buddy was a very proud United States Marine. He wore a Marine Corps hat, and his living room table was covered with military honors, including decorations from combat in Vietnam. Buddy said that he and his wife had moved here from Pennsylvania a few years back after a severe fall ended Buddy's military career, and now they were just enjoying retirement. But Buddy acknowledged that their daughter, Janelle, really struggled sometimes. He explained that she had a hearing problem when she was young that made it really difficult for her to carry on normal conversations, and at 6 feet tall, she felt really awkward and struggled to talk to boys. So as the years went by, she spent more and more of her time alone at home. Buddy said that his daughter was so vulnerable that he and his wife often had to be very protective. Anybody who wanted to do something socially with Janelle had to meet Buddy and her mother, Barbara, first. And Buddy said they worried constantly that Janelle was being bullied. That's when Barbara chimed in. She said the feud between their family and Billie Jean and her friends was a perfect example of the way Janelle was bullied. Barbara said that, Billie Jean and Lindsay would pick on Janelle so regularly that she and Buddy sometimes worried that their daughter might end up hurting herself. Janelle sat quietly as her parents talked about her to the detectives. But eventually, Janelle would speak up, and she would say that she didn't understand why Billie Jean and Lindsay were targeting her. She said she never posted insults about Billie Jean or anybody else online, but some of the people who came to Janelle's defense online fiercely criticized Billie Jean and Lindsay. Janelle said she believed that Billie Jean and Billy and Lindsay were trying to make her feel completely alone. She said that Billy had also attacked her closest supporters, falsely accusing her friend, Jamie Curd, of selling drugs. Lott's eyes widened at the mention of Jamie Curd. He'd heard that name when interviewing people who were close to Billy. And so he stopped Janelle and he asked, "Isn't that Billy's cousin?" And Janelle nodded and said, "Yes." Lott acted surprised. Lott told Janelle he understood that Jamie and Billy were not only relatives, but also close friends. So why would Billy attack Jamie? Janelle explained that Jamie actually was no longer friends with his cousin Billy anymore because he had learned how badly Billy and Billie Jean and Lindsay were mistreating Janelle. The two detectives wrapped up the interview and thanked the Potters for their time. Then they got up and walked outside and made their way over to their car, all the while puzzling over the strange story they'd just heard. Also, Janelle's way of talking just seemed very immature to them, and not just because of her high-pitched, childlike voice, but also because she portrayed everything in terms of petty rivalries that really did seem like something from middle school. But the online harassment that Janelle and her parents described sounded very serious to Lott. And if Janelle really did look at the world like a middle school kid, she would be an easy target. So Lott could see why the Potter family was on edge at the mention of Billy and Billie Jean. Lott and Woodard agreed they needed to speak with Billy's cousin, Jamie, as soon as possible. Clearly, he had a ringside seat for the family feud, and so maybe he could give the detectives some sense of how deep the anger ran on both sides. Later that day, narcotics officers listened politely as Agent Lott described the evidence that Billy and Billie Jean were selling drugs out of their home, potentially putting their lives at risk. But the narcotics officers were not impressed. They said at most, Billy and Billie Jean were small-time dealers who were selling just to their inner circle. The narcotics officers went on to say that typically they investigated people who sold hundreds of times more product than Billy and Billie Jean. If anyone was going to get killed over a drug deal gone bad, it would likely be major dealers, not just some random young couple with a little bag of pills. Nothing the narcotics officers said surprised Lott, but the dead end left him with only one real lead in the case. Now he was even more interested in his upcoming conversation with Jamie Curd. By the time Jamie walked into the sheriff's office on Thursday, February 2nd, so 2 days after the murder, the detectives had thoroughly scrubbed his background. They talked to friends of the victims, as well as Jamie's own sister, about Jamie's relationship with Billy and Janelle. People said that Billy was probably the best friend Jamie had ever had. The two men had worked together on the same exact machine at the thread factory, and then they often went out and partied together after the shift was over. And when Jamie's dog died a few years ago, Billy had even come over with beer to commiserate and to comfort his cousin. And when Jamie couldn't find a girlfriend, Billy had introduced him to Janelle Potter, who had just as much trouble getting a date as Jamie did. And Jamie and Janelle hit it off and began spending time together, but they had one problem. Janelle's parents did not like Jamie. At one point, they even banned him from coming inside their house. And so that was when Jamie began offering to come over and repair the Potter family's computers, because it was literally the only way he could think of that he could still see Janelle. But Jamie's relationship with Janelle ultimately drove a wedge between Jamie and his cousin Billy as the online feud spread to Facebook and other social media, and then to the courts. In the end, Jamie had to choose between his girl and his best friend, and he picked his girl, and the two men stopped speaking to each other. Now, the detectives wondered how far Jamie would go to defend Janelle. From the moment Jamie entered the police interview room, with a baseball hat pulled down low over his sleepy eyes, Lott had the sense of a man who was a follower, not a leader. Jamie himself was quick to make it clear that he was a country boy who had never strayed too far from eastern Tennessee. He said he didn't really use computers much himself, even though he was enough of a handyman to repair them, but he knew that Billy and Billie Jean were posting threats against Janelle on Facebook and other websites. And Jamie just couldn't understand why Billy would do that, or why Billy denied that it was true. Jamie said he saw firsthand the damage that Billy and Billie Jean's threats were doing to Janelle. Jamie said he had seen Janelle suffer these paralyzing panic attacks over some of the things that Billy and Billie Jean were saying about her. And Jamie said at some point he just couldn't take it. He just could not bear to watch his girl get hurt. Detective Lott said he could only imagine how hard it would be to watch your girlfriend be bullied. Jamie tried to interrupt, claiming that Janelle was not his girlfriend, but Lott ignored him. He said it must have been hard for Jamie to keep from hurting the people who were hurting Janelle. Then Lott leaned forward and looked right at Jamie, and he asked him a very surprising and blunt question. Would you shoot a woman with a baby in her arms? Startled, Jamie just sat there for a moment before he answered with one word: no. And Jamie instantly offered to take a lie detector test to prove he really had nothing to do with these murders. And after that, he went silent. And so the detectives just sat there in silence and stared at Jamie, hoping he would eventually chime in with useful information. And for a while, all Jamie did was just sit slouched in his chair, but then suddenly Jamie sat up and he began wildly looking all around the interview room as though he was looking for someone who was watching them. Then he looked right at the detectives, and his eyes were wide and his voice got really quiet, and he asked them, "Is the CIA here?" Lott and his partner were dumbfounded, but also intrigued. Why would the Central Intelligence Agency, the country's international spy agency, have anything to do with a double murder in rural Tennessee? Jamie glanced from detective to detective, hoping for an answer to his question, but the two detectives didn't say anything, mostly because this was a totally outrageous question that didn't seem legitimate. But what was absolutely clear in this moment was the two detectives knew they had to figure out what in the world Jamie was talking about. On the other side of town, Janelle's mother, Barbara, had no idea that Jamie was talking to the police at that very moment. But she would have known exactly why Jamie was asking about the CIA. And she, for one, was grateful that one particular spy did keep an eye on Mountain City, Tennessee. For more than a year, Barbara had been emailing back and forth with a CIA agent named Chris, and they had grown very close, like mother and son. In fact, she even sometimes addressed him as son. Chris, the CIA agent, had gone to high school with Janelle more than a decade earlier. And even though his career had taken him around the world since those days, he still kept a protective eye on his high school classmate, and he would let Barbara know whenever he learned of any threats to Janelle's safety. Months before the murders, in April of 2011, Chris had emailed Barbara to let her know that Billie Jean and 2 other women had been prowling around their property at night. Chris said he suspected the women were up to no good, but he was in no position to do anything. He had just broken his arm, and he was in a cast. However, Chris said he had tapped the phone line in Billie and Billie Jean's house, so he would be able to keep track of their conversations. That way, they would know if Billie and Billie Jean were planning anything else. Barbara couldn't thank Chris enough for the warning. He was like a guardian angel. "We love you, son," she wrote back to him. And in the email, she also reassured Chris that her husband, Buddy, was in, quote, Vietnam jungle recon mode, end quote, and he would be ready if any intruders tried to enter their home. Billie's cousin Jamie had also struck up a relationship with Chris, the CIA agent, and Jamie often poured his heart out to the spy about how much he loved Janelle. Chris had assured Jamie that he had a great girl, but he warned Jamie that Billie and Billie Jean and their friends, they really wanted to make Janelle's life hell, and that would definitely affect Jamie's life. So when Jamie returned to the police station to take his lie detector test that he requested on February 6, 2012, so almost a week after the murders, he hoped that Chris, the CIA agent, might be looking out for him. But things didn't go so well for Jamie. The lie detector analyst concluded that Jamie was being deceptive when he claimed he didn't know anything about the murders of Billie and Billie Jean. And so this meant it was very likely that Jamie was hiding something. And this was exactly what Agent Lott was hoping for. Now he'd be able to really up the pressure on Jamie and basically force him to either spill his guts or risk facing first-degree murder charges. And so Agent Lott walked into the interview room where Jamie was once again waiting, and Lott felt ready to break this man down. For the next 2 hours, Lott, along with another detective, threw one question after another at Jamie. What was he hiding? Why was he lying? Was anyone else involved in the murders? And Jamie just sat there mumbling, I don't know, or just grumbling without even answering at all. Finally, the detectives actually started taking pity on Jamie, saying they knew he was not the mastermind. He was probably just following someone else's instructions. Lott said that maybe Jamie didn't shoot anyone, but he needed to tell them who did. But Jamie just continued to mumble and stammer his way, and so Lott was getting really frustrated. So he just left the room and typed up a written statement, a confession for Jamie to sign, that admitted he played a role in the murders. And so Lott came back in the room with the statement, and he slid the confession with a pen across the table to Jamie, and Jamie just stared at it for a long time, doing nothing. But eventually, Jamie picked up the pen and he signed his name down at the bottom. After the interrogation ended, Jamie looked completely defeated, and so he very quickly just agreed to let the detectives come out to the parking lot and search his car. And in his car, scrawled on a scrap of paper on the front passenger seat, the detectives found email addresses for not only Jamie, but also for Barbara and Janelle. This was like a goldmine to Lott. Now that Jamie had confessed to a backup role in the murders, the detectives could get a search warrant to see all the messages written to and from these email addresses in the months leading up to the murders. If there was a larger plot to murder Billie and Billie Jean, then the detectives would soon know about it. A few days later, the email company sent the detectives an electronic file containing thousands of emails sent or received by Jamie, Barbara, and Janelle over the previous year. And so suddenly, the detectives had a window into why the Potter family lived in such fear. The detectives quickly started seeing correspondence from a CIA agent named Chris Chodden, who was warning with increasing urgency that Billie, Billie Jean, and their friends were harassing and threatening Janelle. The emails were chatty and personal, sometimes weaving in stories from Chris's CIA work or references to his 3 Great Danes, but frequently coming back to his concerns that these bullies might follow through on their threats to hurt Janelle. Lott couldn't believe that a CIA agent would use his official position to get involved in a family feud in rural Tennessee. The emails showed that for months in 2011, Chris had tried to get a CIA ID card for Janelle's father, Buddy, so that Buddy could acquire military-grade weapons that are normally off-limits to civilians. And so the whole thing just seemed extremely unprofessional to the detectives. So Lott and another detective decided to track down Chris and just ask him what was going on. The detectives found a guy named Chris Chodden who graduated with Janelle from a high school in Pennsylvania, and so Lott got his phone number and called him up. Chris seemed surprised to be getting a call from police in Tennessee, but he agreed to talk. And the next day, Lott and the other detective drove up from Mountain City to Delaware to meet with Chris for coffee at his house. After the detectives and Chris had taken a seat at the kitchen table, they talked for a few minutes, just kind of general niceties, and then Lott just pushed a stack of papers across the table to Chris and told him they were copies of emails that he had written to his old high school classmate, Janelle Potter. But Chris just looked blankly at the papers and then at the detectives, and he said he had never sent an email to Janelle Potter, ever. He knew her in high school, but they were never really friends and did not stay in touch after graduation. He said he didn't know what those papers were, but they had nothing to do with him. Lott then asked Chris about his work for the CIA, and Chris nearly broke out laughing. The CIA? Chris said he was a police officer, just like the two detectives, but he had never had anything to do with the CIA, and he certainly wasn't a spy. Lott asked Chris if he had broken his arm recently, and Chris said he had never broken it. Lott and the other detective believed Chris. He was nothing like the brash CIA agent in the emails, and he seemed genuinely surprised to be asked questions about a woman he barely knew. But now Lott needed to know, if Chris was not the author of all those emails, who was? The emails that the detectives had obtained from their search warrant were enough to fill an entire banker's box when they were printed out, and they included countless emails from Chris himself. But using them to solve a crime was another question altogether. They were not in any particular order, and they covered a wide array of subjects, from everyday trivia like Janelle's love of floppy-eared dogs to Chris's tale of international assassinations. If investigators were going to figure out Chris's true identity, they needed a specialist who could really focus and not be distracted by every twist and turn of the investigation. So they turned to a veteran state prosecutor, Dennis Brooks, who agreed to read every single email until he had a better sense of who Chris really was. For days, Brooks spent his evenings immersed in the electronic world that the Potters and Jamie shared with Chris. Brooks concluded that Chris, if nothing else, wrote like he was a homicidal maniac. In notes to Buddy, Barbara, and Jamie alike, Chris would talk about the need to eliminate Billy and Billie Jean and their friends. He closed one message in particular to the Potters with the words, "Kill, kill, kill," all in capital letters. And of course, Brooks suspected that whoever this person was, this Chris person, they did not work for the CIA. Real CIA operatives, the kind who killed people as part of their job, were notoriously secretive, and Chris was anything but. He seemed to openly brag about his most important assignments. But there was one striking thing about every single one of the notes from Chris that convinced Brooks that the real author, the real Chris, could only be one person. And that person was the mastermind behind the murders of Billy and Billie Jean, using others as unwitting pawns. The night that Jamie Curd signed his confession, he did finally break down and talk in great detail about his role in the murders. Then, once investigators had thoroughly analyzed all the emails, they did have a clear picture of how the murders played out. And so here is a reconstruction of how police believe Billy and Billie Jean were murdered in their home on January 31st. Around midnight on January 31st, so right as Billy was crawling into bed, a few miles away, Billy and Billie Jean's killer told Jamie that they needed a favor from him. Would Jamie take a ride to Billy and Billie Jean's house and stand lookout? Jamie knew what this favor really meant. The killer was finally going to take drastic action against Billy and Billie Jean, and they needed someone else for backup. Jamie did not like this idea, but he had known this night was coming for months, and so he agreed to go. So Jamie and the killer drove to a church that was near Billy and Billie Jean's house, where they could see whoever left or entered, and they waited. Eventually, they saw the light go on as Billie Jean brought her baby into the kitchen for a bottle. Then they saw Billy's father packing his lunch for work, and then walking out the door around 5:30 a.m. This was the moment they were waiting for, when Billy and Billie Jean were all alone with just their baby in the house. Now, the couple was going to get what was coming to them. Jamie and the killer put on gloves, and then the killer gave Jamie a handgun so they'd both be armed. Then the killer and Jamie got out of the car, they made their way over to Billy and Billie Jean's house, and the killer slid open the unlocked glass doors on the side of the house, and then they walked inside and headed straight for Billy and Billie Jean's bedroom. Once the killer reached the bedroom, they stood in the doorway to gather their courage for a moment, and then they entered the room. And as soon as they did, Billy woke up and he yelled out, "What the hell?" But the killer was on top of Billy before he could do anything. And the killer put their gun just inches from Billy's face and fired. At this point, Billie Jean, who's right next to Billy, began to scream and she ran out of the room, but she didn't get far because Jamie was standing guard in front of the door that would lead outside. So Billie Jean couldn't escape. Instead, she ran down the hallway to her baby's room and pulled him out of the crib and held him close to her body. And then the killer just stepped into the room, rushed at Billie Jean, they raised their gun and shot her point blank in the side of the head. Billie Jean crumpled onto the floor, still clutching her baby. The killer simply turned around, walked back into the hall, and headed back to the main bedroom. And there, they walked back over to Billy, and just to make sure he was dead, the killer drew a knife and slit Billy's throat, ear to ear. Then the killer walked out of the bedroom and met Jamie at the front door. Jamie gave his gun back to the killer and then ran outside to vomit. And that was it. The intruders got back in their car and sped off. They were in and out of the house in less than 3 minutes, leaving behind 2 dead bodies and a baby who would grow up without parents. But the killer was satisfied with what they had done. At least now his daughter, Janelle, would be safe. Buddy Potter, Janelle's father, killed Billy and Billie Jean. But police did not believe he was the one who actually set the murders in motion, or that he was the one pretending to be the mysterious CIA agent, Chris. Still, police easily had enough evidence to arrest Buddy, and they hoped that once they had him in custody, he would confirm that somebody else had pushed him to kill. But Buddy owned dozens of guns, and he often carried them no matter what he was doing, whether he was mowing the grass or out at a restaurant, he was always carrying. So when Agent Lott and Chief Deputy Woodard drove out to the Potter house early on a mid-February morning to arrest Buddy, they called ahead to let Buddy know they were just coming by with some follow-up questions. The last thing the 2 detectives wanted was to surprise Buddy and accidentally trigger an armed standoff. When they got there, Buddy let the 2 detectives into the house, but the moment Lott told him they were actually there to arrest him for murder, Buddy reached for a gun. But Lott and Woodard were ready, and they instantly tackled Buddy, pinning his arms and getting him into handcuffs. Then they dragged him outside, put him in the cruiser, and went back to the sheriff's office. On the ride, the detectives told Buddy they knew that he loved his family and he was just trying to protect them. He was no monster. After all, Buddy didn't kill the baby. The detectives reassured Buddy that they understood. The world was going to hell, and sometimes violence was the only solution, right? After all, someone else had warned Buddy his daughter was in danger. And with that, tears began to well up in Buddy's eyes in the backseat of the cruiser, and his voice cracked as he shared with the detectives all the terrible things the CIA agent Chris had told him that Billy and Billie Jean were going to do to his daughter. And it was just too much for him. He had to act. Now, while Buddy clearly missed all the red flags in the emails coming from the CIA agent Chris that clearly indicated he was not who he said he was, the state prosecutor, Dennis Brooks, who reviewed all those emails, he caught the red flags, and it was one particular red flag, a chronic error that popped up in many of the emails, that ultimately led Brooks to discover the fake CIA agent's true identity. Time and again in these emails, Chris made a spelling mistake that was far more typical for a schoolchild than an adult CIA agent. Chris always forgot to drop the letter E from the end of verbs when he added the letters ing to them. So words like loving, taking, and caring all contained the extra E in the middle. And that was the same error that Brooks had seen over and over again when reading emails sent from another person, Janelle Potter. And so Brooks told investigators that Chris had been a figment of Janelle's imagination all along, but one that she had used to very effectively manipulate her entire family. Janelle had basically catfished her own family into believing that she was in mortal danger, and ultimately, that caused her father to go out and kill Billy and Billie Jean. A year and a half later, Buddy Potter, Janelle's father, was found guilty of killing Billy and Billie Jean and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. As for Jamie Curd, the star prosecution witness, he agreed to a plea deal that required him to serve 25 years in prison. Janelle and her mother Barbara went on trial for their roles in promoting the double murder. Janelle's attorney argued that she was too childlike to murder anyone, and she shouldn't be punished because her father was overly protective. But the jury was not buying it, and ultimately she and her mother were both sentenced to life in prison. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts: MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Just after 1:30 in the morning on May 12, 1994, a young girl ran out the front door of her home in rural Maine out into the rainy night. Barefoot and terrified, the girl went door to door screaming for help, but no one heard her. Finally, after running nearly 2 miles in the dead of night, she arrived in her little downtown and managed to flag down a restaurant owner. The owner would help the girl call 911, and within minutes, the police would arrive at that young girl's home. And what they would discover there was one of the most horrific crimes ever committed in that small town. Not only because of its sheer brutality, but also because of who committed it and why. We tried to make this story make sense, but sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please delete all the music off of the Amazon Music follow button's phone and replace it with every episode of the brand new Ballen Studios podcast, Bedtime Stories. Just search for Ballen Studios and then look for Bedtime Stories on Amazon Music. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of August 23, 1993, Crystal Perry got ready for work in the bedroom of her small white wooden house in Bridgeton, Maine. And she was excited because it was her 30th birthday. Crystal was very attractive with pale freckled skin, light blue eyes, and thick, bright red hair. Her hair actually was so bright that it made her almost immediately recognizable wherever she went in her small town. And on the rare occasions when Crystal went out to a bar or went dancing with her friends, her looks made her the center of attention. Or they made her an object of desire for men watching her from a distance who couldn't get the nerve up to go talk to her. In her bedroom, Crystal finished getting dressed for work, and then she called out to her 11-year-old daughter, Sarah, to let her know it was time to go. But Sarah was already standing behind her mom, and she shouted, "Happy birthday!" Crystal was startled, but she turned around and gave Sarah a big hug. Crystal had only been 18 years old when Sarah was born, and she had actually only been 15 years old when she married Sarah's father. At such a young age, Crystal's parents had to give their legal permission for the marriage to take place. But the marriage didn't last, and Crystal had gotten divorced when Sarah was a little girl. Since then, Crystal and Sarah had pretty much been on their own, and they were as close as a mother and daughter could get. They spent almost every night together, watching movies, reading books, and talking and laughing in their house. Even as Sarah got older, Crystal still made it a point to tuck her in before bed, and sometimes she would even sing to her until she fell asleep. And on that morning of her 30th birthday, Crystal was heading out to her job at a local shoe factory that she had only taken just so she could make enough money to afford the little house where she and her daughter lived. The work Crystal did, sewing parts of shoes by hand, was totally backbreaking, and she would come home from work at night feeling totally tired and smelling of chemicals from the factory. But Crystal thought the long hours and hard work was all worth it because Sarah had a home and a room of her own. Crystal and Sarah walked outside, they got into Crystal's car in the driveway, and drove down the road through Brighton. Their house was secluded and surrounded by woods, and there were only a few houses nearby. But after a short drive, they pulled up to the house of a family friend where Sarah was going to spend the day. Crystal gave her daughter a kiss, told her she loved her, and then waved goodbye as Sarah walked up to the house. Then Crystal drove off and headed to work. When Crystal was a few minutes away from the shoe factory, she slowed down and stared out the windshield. There were these black balloons tied to a telephone pole. It was a weird sight, and Crystal didn't know what the balloons were for. And then things got even weirder when she saw more black balloons tied to telephone poles at regular intervals along the road. Then, when she was just outside of work, she saw even more black balloons, but this time they were attached to a huge sign that said, "Happy 30th, Crystal." Crystal nearly slammed on her brakes, and she almost started crying out of happiness. She couldn't believe her friends and coworkers had taken the time to set all this up just to make her feel special on her birthday. Then she started laughing when she realized they'd chosen black balloons because she was 30 years old now. Crystal parked her car and walked into work, and there were even more balloons and signs waiting for her. And that day, they had a huge party for her at the factory, but that was just the beginning of Crystal's birthday celebration. That night at the house, Crystal made dinner, and Sarah set the table. Crystal's boyfriend, Dennis Butler, was on his way over to join them for Crystal's birthday dinner, and Sarah was very excited. She liked Dennis because he was funny and nice to her, and he didn't talk to her like she was a little kid. Crystal was happy that Dennis was good with Sarah and that Sarah liked him, but Crystal still wasn't sure about her own relationship with Dennis. Dennis was about to turn 20 years old, but he worked full-time and he'd actually already been married before, so he seemed older than he was. But Crystal still just felt totally strange about the 10-year age gap between them. Still, Crystal and Dennis always had a good time together, and she knew finding the right guy in a small town wasn't always easy. The tourists who came to Bridgeton, Maine from all across New England saw it as a quaint little city with stunning natural beauty and charming shops and restaurants. But the people who lived there knew there was actually a side of the town that the tourists did not see. Drug use and drug dealing had been a problem in the area for years. In fact, one of Dennis's old high school classmates who lived not too far from Crystal, a guy named Michael Hutchinson, was known to show up to bars in town or just to walk around the streets totally high on cocaine. So, as Crystal put the finishing touches on dinner, she told herself that at least Dennis had not fallen into that kind of lifestyle. And it was her birthday, so she just wanted to be happy and have a good time and not spend the night worrying about her future with Dennis. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the front door, and so Sarah walked across the linoleum kitchen floor, went through the small living room, and opened the door, and there was Dennis. Dennis said hello to Sarah and gave her a big hug, and then he shouted happy birthday to Crystal. Dennis was tall and thin with dark hair and a square jaw, and he wore a gold earring in one of his ears. He went into the kitchen, gave Crystal a kiss, and then handed her a birthday card and a present. And a few minutes later, Crystal, Sarah, and Dennis sat down at the kitchen table and had dinner, and then they ate the birthday cake. After dinner and cake, Sarah helped her mom clear the dishes and put them in the sink. Then she handed her mom a small box with a bow on it. Crystal opened the present, and right away she got choked up. Sarah had gotten her this little pewter figurine of a warrior woman holding a sword, a perfect symbol of a single mother who fought as hard as she could to take care of her daughter. The three of them went into the living room and talked for a while. Then at some point, Sarah felt tired, so she got up, said goodnight to her mom and Dennis, and headed up to her bedroom. Crystal didn't tuck Sarah in that night because she stayed on the couch talking to Dennis. And so Sarah lay in bed thinking that Dennis and her mom might get married soon, and the thought of that made her happy. But as Sarah began to drift off to sleep, she began hearing yelling from the living room. And not long after that, Sarah heard the front door slam shut. And then she heard Dennis's car screeching out of the driveway. Sarah had no idea what had happened, but it obviously sounded bad, but she just stayed there in bed and tried to go to sleep. Crystal sat in the living room, crying on the couch. Her perfect birthday had fallen apart because Dennis had flown off the handle and gotten totally upset with her. She didn't actually know why he'd gotten upset. Maybe it was because she mentioned that she was not sure about their future, or maybe it was something Crystal wasn't even aware of. But the reason for the outburst didn't really matter to Crystal, because when Dennis had gotten angry, he got loud and scary. And she decided that was not the kind of guy she wanted around her daughter anymore. And so, before Dennis had stormed out of the house, Crystal had made it clear to him that their relationship was over. Crystal wiped the tears from her eyes, went to her room, and got ready for bed. Then she climbed under the covers and stared up at the ceiling. She knew the black balloons her friends and coworkers had gotten her for her birthday had been a joke, but for the first time, Crystal really did feel old. However, she hoped, now that she was 30, that her life would get a little calmer and easier, and that she wouldn't have any more nights that ended in shouting matches. But not long after Crystal's 30th birthday, for reasons even Crystal couldn't totally figure out, Crystal let Dennis right back into her life. Dennis spent the next several months trying to convince Crystal to put their past arguments behind them. He worked hard to prove that she could trust him, and he did everything he could to win her back. And Sarah found herself hoping that her mom and Dennis would make things work and stay together for good this time. And eventually, Dennis proposed to Crystal, and Crystal said yes. And for a time after the proposal, Crystal and Sarah thought their lives were about to change for good. And, along with Dennis, they would become this happy, loving family. On the night of May 11th, 1994, so 9 months after Crystal's 30th birthday, Crystal sat at the foot of Sarah's bed. Sarah was 12 years old now, but she still liked talking to her mom every night before she went to sleep. And for the past few weeks, Sarah had felt like she was comforting Crystal more than Crystal was comforting her when they talked at night. Because even though Crystal and Dennis were still engaged, their relationship had taken a bad turn again. They had started getting on each other's nerves again, and there were lots of nights that Sarah fell asleep listening to the sound of them screaming at each other in the living room. And there were other nights when Dennis was not at the house that the phone would ring, Crystal would answer, and she would hear screaming on the other line, and so she would just hang up. Sarah knew her mom was worried about the arguments and the angry phone calls, but whenever the mother and daughter were together, Crystal never let on that she was upset. She was always very positive and upbeat around her daughter. Crystal thought that no matter what happened with her and Dennis, that she and Sarah would be just fine. In the bedroom, Crystal said goodnight to Sarah, kissed her on the forehead, turned off the light, and walked out of the room. She went to her own bedroom, got undressed, and slipped on a blue terry cloth robe. Then she went to the living room, picked up a book, sat down on the couch, and started to read. Crystal could hear the rain falling on the roof. She loved that sound. It made her feel relaxed and safe somehow, like the rain would let her hide away from the rest of the world. But after midnight on May 12th, there was a sudden knock at the front door. Crystal put her book down and quickly walked across the living room. She didn't know who was there, but she didn't want their knocking to wake up her daughter. Crystal opened up the door just a little bit, and then she and the person standing outside talked briefly. Then Crystal smiled, opened the door wide, and let the visitor into the house. Just before 1 a.m., so less than an hour after this visitor had knocked on the door and come inside, Sarah woke up in her bed. She heard shouting coming from the kitchen, and so she figured her mom must be in another fight with Dennis. So Sarah closed her eyes and tried to go back to sleep. But then Sarah heard her mom scream, "No!" over and over and over. Sarah got scared and yelled to her mom, but Crystal just kept screaming, "No, no!" from the kitchen. Sarah immediately got out of bed and grabbed her white terry cloth robe that was similar to her mom's, put it on over her pajamas, and crept across her room to the door as quietly as possible. She wanted to help her mom, but she didn't know what to do, so she just crouched there by the door and listened. Then she heard something like boots stomping in the kitchen, and she heard a loud crash like something had fallen onto the floor. Sarah stayed in her room, too terrified to move. Then the house fell silent, and she thought about running out of her room, but suddenly she heard footsteps in the kitchen again, so she kept waiting inside of her bedroom by the door. Minutes later, Sarah heard the sound of the front door opening and shutting, and then there was no more sound coming from the living room or the kitchen. So Sarah stood up, flung her door open, and ran from her bedroom to the front of the house. She looked into the kitchen and she screamed. Sarah saw her mother lying on the kitchen floor. There was blood on her robe and her legs, and near her was the phone that was off the hook. Sarah began yelling for her mother, but Crystal didn't respond. So Sarah grabbed the phone and tried 911, but the phone wasn't working. It just kept on beeping. So Sarah dropped the phone, ran out of the kitchen and out the front door into the rain. She felt wet grass and mud on her bare feet as she turned up the road and ran towards her closest neighbor's house. When she got there, Sarah rushed up to her neighbor's door and started knocking and screaming, but there was no movement inside and nobody answered the door. So Sarah turned and ran to the house across the street. She was cold, her robe was soaked, and her feet were caked in mud. She banged on the door as hard as she could and she waited, but again nobody answered the door. So Sarah turned again up the road and started running into town. By this point, her legs were burning and she was totally out of breath. Sometime after about 1:30 in the morning, after Sarah had run for about 1.5 miles in the rain, she made it into town. She saw a light on inside a small Italian restaurant, so she ran to the restaurant door and started pounding on it. Then she noticed a light go on in the small apartment above the restaurant where the owners lived. And a few seconds later, a man and a woman, the restaurant owners, opened the door. The woman looked totally shocked when she saw Sarah standing there in the rain covered in mud. The woman wrapped her arms around Sarah and brought her into the restaurant. The owners asked what was going on, and Sarah said her mother had just been attacked at their home. The man took Sarah's hand and led her to the phone, while the woman went back upstairs to get Sarah a blanket and dry clothes. The man dialed 911 and told the operator that he needed police assistance immediately and then handed the phone to Sarah. And then Sarah spoke as clearly as she could and told the operator that her mom was at her house and that she was hurt and that there was blood everywhere. A few minutes after the 911 call, Detective Dick Pickett of the Maine State Police drove down a dark, rural stretch of road toward Crystal and Sarah's home. The rain was still falling, and even with the moon shining, visibility wasn't great. But Pickett saw the flashing lights of an ambulance, so he was able to find his way to the small white wooden house nestled in the trees. Pickett parked his car and stepped outside onto the wet, muddy ground. He was about average height, his brown hair was starting to thin, and he wore glasses. He walked into the house and he saw paramedics in the kitchen, but they had already pronounced Crystal Perry, the victim, dead at the scene. So Pickett walked over to Crystal's body. Pickett knew that small Maine towns might not be as picture-perfect as the tourists thought, but he was still shocked at what he saw, and he knew immediately that the news of this crime would cause fear and panic throughout Bridgeton. Pickett couldn't get over the amount of violence that had obviously taken place in this kitchen. His first thought was that this had to have been a crime of passion, carried out by someone who knew Crystal intimately, and whoever had done this had left a huge mess behind. There were bloody boot prints leading from the kitchen to the front door, and there was blood spatter all over the walls and kitchen counters. Soon after Pickett arrived, he was joined by several other state and local police officers and a state forensics team. Pickett led a few of the other officers on a sweep of the house, and they found their way into Sarah's bedroom, where they found the room was totally undisturbed, and there were even a few stuffed animals perfectly placed around the room where Sarah liked to keep them. After the 911 call, an ambulance had been dispatched to the Italian restaurant, and Sarah had been taken to the hospital. Pickett knew he would have to talk to her, but he couldn't imagine what that little girl was feeling at this moment. Pickett and the others checked Crystal's room next, but it also looked like it hadn't been disturbed. So Pickett believed whatever had happened to Crystal only took place in the living room and the kitchen. He walked back towards the kitchen and saw a photographer taking pictures of the scene and forensics officers studying the bloody boot prints on the floors. They hadn't found a murder weapon yet, but they still had plenty of evidence to work with. And Pickett saw a forensics officer crouched over Crystal's body, and she was fixated on one of Crystal's legs. She called Pickett and other forensics officers over, and she pointed to a small drop of blood on Crystal's leg that was almost a perfect circle. Pickett asked why that particular drop of blood was any different than the rest of the blood on Crystal's legs. The forensics officer looked up at him, pointed at the drop of blood again, and said they needed to take a sample of it. Because she knew a drop like that had to be what was known as a passive blood drop. That meant it did not come from Crystal. And in this particular case, the forensics officer said the blood could have only dripped off of someone who was standing right over Crystal and fallen onto her body after she was already dead. So the forensics officer was pretty confident that that drop of blood belonged to Crystal's killer. The forensics team took the blood sample and gathered other blood samples from around the room. But Pickett knew testing them would take time, and having DNA from a blood sample didn't mean authorities would necessarily be able to match it to anyone. So Pickett called his investigative team together. He said he knew it was late, but he wanted to work fast and he wanted to work smart. He sent members of the team out in the middle of the night to see if they could track down and interview Crystal's neighbors, friends, and family. And within a couple of hours, Pickett got news that set the investigation in motion. One of Crystal's friends had told police that 2 weeks earlier, Crystal's fiancé, Dennis, had shown up to Crystal's house waving a knife around and threatening to kill her. At 4 a.m., 2.5 hours after police arrived at Crystal's house, Detective Pickett and 3 other officers knocked on the door of Dennis's parents' house where Dennis was staying. It took a few minutes, but Dennis finally answered and let the police inside. Pickett asked Dennis if he had seen Crystal that night, and then Dennis did something that kind of stunned all of the officers. Instead of answering the question, Dennis started pacing the room and he turned to the cops and asked, "Is Crystal dead?" And as soon as that happened, the police decided they really needed to bring Dennis in right away for questioning. A little later that morning, Dennis sat across from Pickett and the other members of the investigative team in a small, cramped police interrogation room. Pickett didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He told Dennis that in the few hours since they had found Crystal's body, they had already learned that she and Dennis had a pretty rough relationship and that Dennis was known to have a temper and to get aggressive. Dennis admitted that things were bad between him and Crystal, but that didn't mean he was a killer. He said a lot of couples yell and scream at each other when they argue. Then, in a calm voice, Pickett asked if Dennis was at all responsible for Crystal's death, and Dennis said no. But then, Dennis started shaking, almost like he was having convulsions. Every cop in the room had seen suspects get nervous and have trouble staying still during interrogations, but none of them had seen anything like this before. They got Dennis calmed down and made sure he was physically okay. Then they asked him if he'd be willing to submit samples for DNA testing. Then Dennis steadied himself and said he would. After hours with the police, Dennis left the station, and Pickett thought there was a good chance that once the test results came in, Dennis's DNA would match the DNA from the drop of blood the forensics team had taken from Crystal's leg and from other similar drops they had found in the kitchen. So Pickett thought there was a pretty good chance he'd be able to close this case quickly. On the afternoon of May 12th, so a few hours after police had questioned Dennis, Detective Pickett and another officer walked into a small bedroom inside of Sarah's grandmother's house, so Crystal's mother's house. There, they saw Crystal's 12-year-old daughter, Sarah, sitting almost motionless on the bed, staring at the sunlight that was coming in through the window. After Sarah had been released from the hospital, she had been sent to stay with her grandmother. Pickett approached Sarah and introduced himself. Then, Pickett very calmly and gently asked Sarah to please tell them what had happened at her house the night before. Sarah took a deep breath and then told the officers that she had been asleep and then heard her mom screaming in the other room. She said she had stayed in her own room until everything went quiet. Then she told the officers about how she found her mom in the kitchen, how she tried to call the police, and then how she ended up running outside and all the way into town to get help. Pickett smiled at Sarah and then asked her if she had maybe caught a glimpse of the person who was with her mother, or if maybe she had recognized this person's voice. Sarah stared at Pickett. She didn't like how he was talking to her, like she was just a little kid. Sarah said she didn't see the other person because she stayed in her room the whole time, and all she had heard was shouting, so she couldn't make out the other person's voice. Pickett smiled again, then he asked her if she liked her mother's boyfriend, Dennis, and was it maybe possible that Sarah knew Dennis had been in their house, but she just didn't want to say that because she wanted to protect him. Sarah glared at Pickett. She was young, but she was smart and observant, and she thought the police wanted her to be an eyewitness who had seen the man who they already believed had killed her mom. But Sarah said she really didn't know who else had been in the house. Pickett thanked Sarah for talking to them, and he and the other officer walked out of the room and headed outside. Pickett did believe Dennis was the most likely culprit, but police would have to wait weeks on DNA test results, and Pickett had no intention of excluding any other leads that might come up between now and those results coming in. Later that day, the investigative team met with more of Crystal's friends and coworkers, and most of them pointed the finger at Dennis too. They knew about his and Crystal's history, and they knew about Dennis's temper. But a few of her friends said there was another man police should look into, Crystal's ex-husband and Sarah's father, Tom Perry. So Pickett began digging into Tom's background right away. He discovered that Crystal had been after Tom to pay the monthly child support that he owed her because he was not giving her the money that the court had ordered him to pay after he and Crystal got divorced. Pickett figured if Crystal had been after Tom for money, that might have been a motive for Tom to attack her. But as Pickett learned about Tom, he started to think there might actually be an even more likely suspect than him, because Pickett found out that Crystal had once filed a restraining order against one of Tom's girlfriends, Joanne Stager. And after speaking to one of Crystal's friends, Pickett learned that in the past few weeks, Joanne had been harassing Crystal. And it turned out that those angry, disturbing phone calls Crystal had been getting at the house were not coming from Dennis like Sarah thought. They had been coming from Joanne, and she had been threatening Crystal. 2 days after Crystal's murder, Detective Pickett and members of his team sat in the living room across from Crystal's ex-husband Tom and his girlfriend Joanne at the house the couple shared. The investigative team still considered Crystal's boyfriend Dennis their primary suspect, but with new information about Tom, and especially about his girlfriend Joanne, they had another promising lead. Pickett looked at the couple sitting on the couch. They were both in their 30s, and they were both tall and had dark hair. And Joanne couldn't seem to stay still for more than a few seconds at a time. Pickett asked Tom about his relationship with Crystal, and when he did, Pickett immediately saw a look of anger come across Joanne's face. But Tom would answer, and he would say that he barely ever talked to Crystal anymore, and he said he totally regretted this, but he didn't really play any meaningful role in his daughter, Sarah's, life. After that, Pickett turned to Joanne and asked her about the restraining order Crystal had filed against her. Joanne kind of laughed, and then she told Pickett a story like she was performing on a stage. She said a couple years earlier she had seen Crystal's red hair from across the dance floor at a club, and she had seen men watching Crystal from all over the place like they always did. But she wasn't angry about that. She was angry because she believed Crystal still had a thing for Tom, and she was tired of Crystal calling the house. So she had marched across the dance floor and confronted Crystal about it. She said Crystal had gotten angry and looked like she was about to start a fight, and so preemptively, Joanne punched her in the face. As Pickett listened to this story, he had trouble believing that anybody other than Joanne had been the cause of that fight. After she was done, Pickett asked her about the angry phone calls, and Joanne said she was just telling Crystal to back off and to leave Tom alone. But Joanne said she would never kill anyone. Finally, Pickett asked where each of them had been at the time of Crystal's murder, and they said they had been together at the house. Pickett knew they could be telling the truth, but each of them being the other's alibi wasn't nearly enough for Pickett to accept their story. So he asked if they would submit DNA samples for testing. Tom and Joanne looked at each other, and then they both looked back at Pickett and said they would be willing to do that. Later that day, Pickett returned to the station. As he looked over his notes from the interviews police had already conducted, he still thought Dennis made the most sense as the suspect. But after meeting with Tom and Joanne, he definitely thought there were other viable suspects. Then, on May 15th, 3 days after Crystal's murder, her friends and family held a small funeral service at a church before Crystal was to be cremated. Sarah stood in the church quietly, and she listened to friends and family talk about her mother and about how much her mom had loved her. And then at some point, Sarah's mother's siblings got up and they said they would get justice for Crystal, whatever it took. And then after the funeral, members of the investigative team heard from one of Crystal's friends that Joanne had been seen popping open champagne and toasting to Crystal's death. And after that, at least some members of the state police started to believe Joanne was just as likely to have killed Crystal as Dennis. In early summer of 1994, weeks after Crystal's murder, results from DNA testing conducted during the investigation started to trickle in, and those results left Detective Pickett and the investigative team in complete shock. The DNA sample from the drop of blood taken from Crystal's leg and other samples taken from her body and around the crime scene did not match the DNA samples provided by Dennis, Tom, or Joanne. Investigators had become so convinced that one of those three people had killed Crystal that they had trouble accepting these DNA results. So they asked for the lab to run the tests again. But when they did, the results were the same. There was no match to any of the main suspects in the case. After that, the authorities ran the DNA test results through something called CODIS, which is a massive FBI database with DNA results from convicted offenders of violent crimes from across the country. And in 1994, the FBI had just started using CODIS to assist police investigations nationwide. So Pickett had high hopes that this new technology would help keep his investigation on track. But the DNA samples taken from Crystal and her house did not match anyone in this massive FBI database. So all of a sudden, this case that had three strong suspects who all had clear motives completely fell apart, and Pickett and his team found themselves having to start all over. But after reassessing the crime scene and conducting a new round of interviews, all of the investigators' theories just felt like pure conjecture. Police followed leads that could possibly connect Crystal's murder to a serial killer who had been caught in the region, but DNA evidence also quickly ruled that out as well. Then, investigators started to look at the possibility that Crystal's murder could have been a robbery gone wrong. Maybe some drug user had broken into her house to steal valuables to sell for drug money, and then of course something had gone wrong and Crystal had wound up dead. After all, drugs were a real issue in Bridgeton, Maine. But a drug addict breaking in, or any robber for that matter, didn't really make sense to Pickett. He and members of the forensics team had always believed the level of violence that had taken place in Crystal's murder indicated it must have been a crime of passion, not some random robbery that just got interrupted. So Pickett soon came to terms with the fact that his investigation had almost nothing to go on. And by the summer of 1995, a year after Crystal's murder, her case was just not a top priority anymore, and it started to go cold. And in May of 1996, 2 years after Crystal's murder, there was still no new information coming in. Crystal's siblings posted a $10,000 reward for anyone who could provide information that would lead to the arrest of the person who had killed their sister, but none of the people who then came forward were able to provide any useful evidence. So another year went by with almost nothing new on the case. Then, not long after that, Detective Pickett retired from the Maine State Police, and people in Bridgeton figured they would never know who had killed Crystal. By that time, Sarah had moved to Texas to live with family members there, and she was doing her best to try to live her life. She thought about her mother constantly, but she had started to distance herself from her friends and family in Maine, as well as the police she had met during the investigation. Years went by without Sarah ever hearing anything new about her mother's murder case, and she grew up, graduated high school, went to college, and then got a job. The little 12-year-old girl who had found her mother murdered in the kitchen and who had run across town in the rain in the middle of the night to get help had now become an adult. and like almost everybody else, Sarah had eventually given up on ever knowing who had killed her mom. In April of 2006, almost 12 years after Crystal's murder, Detective Walter Gerzib of the Maine State Police was sitting in his office. Gerzib had been involved in the investigation into Crystal's murder when he was a young officer, and after Pickett retired, Gerzib had moved up the ranks, and he had remained one of the few investigators who continued to try to find new leads in Crystal's murder case. But that case had remained cold for over a decade, so Gerzib was not hopeful that he or anyone else would ever solve it. Gerzib's phone rang at his desk, so he answered it, and an FBI agent introduced themselves on the other line, and after the two had talked for a few minutes, Gerzib couldn't believe what he was hearing. The FBI agent told him a kidnapper had been caught and convicted in Maine. That kidnapper had submitted a DNA sample, and that sample had been run through the FBI database, and it had matched the blood samples that had been found on Crystal and in her house 12 years earlier. Gerzib hung up the phone in total shock. Soon after the call, Gerzib, other members of the Maine State Police, and FBI agents met with this kidnapper who was in custody. And after that meeting, Gerzib would make a phone call he had been waiting to make for years. He would call Crystal's daughter, Sarah, who was 24 years old at the time, and he would tell her that the police finally knew who had killed her mother. Based on the meeting with the convicted kidnapper, interviews conducted during the investigation, and evidence and DNA samples collected from the crime scene, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the night somebody murdered Crystal Perry on May 12, 1994. A little before 1 a.m., the killer listened to the sound of their windshield wipers going back and forth while they drove in the rain down a tree-lined road towards Crystal's house. The killer felt their hands tingling. They figured that feeling was the feeling of anticipation because they'd finally gotten up the guts to do something they had wanted to do for a long time. The killer pulled off the road into Crystal's driveway and parked their car behind hers. They turned off the engine, took the keys out of the ignition, and then sat there just listening to the rain and staring at the house for a couple of minutes. Then the killer got out of the car, walked up the driveway, and knocked on the front door. Crystal opened the door just enough to see who was there, and then moments later, she smiled and let the killer in. The killer walked into the house and made their way towards the kitchen, with Crystal following a couple of feet behind. Once the killer reached the kitchen, they stopped, turned around, and looked Crystal in the eye. The killer took a breath and then walked right up to Crystal and put their arms on her arms and then moved in to give her a kiss. But Crystal immediately pushed the killer off and told them to get out of the house. Without thinking, the killer lunged at Crystal, grabbed her, and pulled her onto the ground. Crystal kicked and thrashed, but she could not get free. And so with Crystal pinned down, the killer began to sexually assault her. After it was over, the killer got up off the floor and quickly walked over to a drawer, opened it up, and pulled out a sharp kitchen knife. Crystal saw it and screamed "no" over and over and over again, pulling herself up off the floor and running for the phone. Crystal managed to grab it, but the killer had wheeled around by this point and wrapped their arms around her, and the phone fell to the floor. The killer then threw Crystal back on the floor and pinned her to the ground again. Then the killer raised the knife, and immediately Crystal threw her fists and kicked wildly at the killer, and the killer suddenly felt the knife slice into their own hand, and they saw blood dripping from it. But the killer kept Crystal pinned to the ground, they raised the knife and slammed it into her chest. After that, Crystal stopped fighting, and her body went limp. But the killer just kept on raising that knife and dropping it over and over and over again. In total, the killer would stab Crystal over 50 times. Finally, the killer stopped stabbing and looked around the room. There was blood everywhere, and their boots had left bloody prints on the floor. And the blood from the cut on the killer's hand kept dripping on Crystal's leg. The killer stood up, pocketed the knife, and walked over to the kitchen counter. They grabbed paper towels, knelt down, and started wiping away some of the blood on the floor. But there was just too much, and they had already been in the house for so long, so the killer just held on to the bloody paper towels. They walked back through the house, went outside, and got into their car. They threw the car in reverse, pulled out onto the road, and drove not far down the road to where they lived in town. Michael Hutchinson, the young man with the drug problem who walked around town all the time high on cocaine, who had gone to high school with Dennis, had murdered Crystal. Michael had never even come up in the investigation because there was really no connection between him and Crystal. It turned out that when Michael came to Crystal's house on the night of the murder, police believe he asked to use her phone because he said he was having car trouble. And Crystal most likely let Michael in because she recognized him as a local and because she was just a nice person. But some members of the police believe Michael was a bit more calculated, that he had probably been one of those men who checked out Crystal from a distance when she was in town or at a bar or on a dance floor. And Michael had wanted her. And so he had shown up to her house, possibly under the influence of alcohol and drugs, and tried to get her to sleep with him. And when Crystal rejected him, Michael went into a blind rage, and he sexually assaulted her and ultimately killed her. And Michael had basically gotten away with it and never even been suspected for years. But then Michael got busted for something totally separate, kidnapping, and he submitted DNA samples, and the FBI database got a hit. Michael's new DNA samples matched the passive blood drops taken from Crystal's leg and from her house. Further tests also showed that Michael's semen matched the semen samples taken from Crystal's body. And finally, when investigators met with Michael, they saw a large scar on his hand from a cut that matched the type of knife that was used to kill Crystal. Michael was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. As of 2023, Sarah, Crystal's daughter, is a very successful author. She wrote a memoir about her life with her mother before the murder and her life after the murder. The book's dedication page simply reads, "For her." Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of those stories are only available on YouTube, not on this podcast. Again, the YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.